We have a new video over at thomhartmann.com for the people who support our program, and it's an interesting one. The phrase, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, has a really interesting history, and the exploitation of that phrase and that history by right-wingers in 20th century America, or late 20th century America, now 21st century America, also has a fascinating and rather grim history. Just the general absurdity of the idea that somebody can lift themselves off the ground by reaching down and pulling on a strap on their boots. I mean, just think about it for a second. But it's used, this is used as justification by right-wingers, particularly over the last 40 years since the Reagan Revolution, to say, oh, poor people, their poverty is their own fault. Check it out. It's over at thomhartmann.com. This is, our book today is Playing with Fire, the 1968 Election and the Transformation of American Politics by Lawrence O'Donnell. The first chapter, Seizing the Moment. It starts in 1968. Richard Nixon was in a makeup chair when he met Roger Ailes. Maybe it was the makeup chair that set Ailes off. He was looking at the man who might have been president right now if he had just sat in the makeup chair CBS offered him in Chicago before the first televised presidential debate in American history. Nixon had ignored the network's makeup artist and used a drugstore product called Lazy Shave to cover his heavy 5 o'clock shadow. Nixon once said, "I can shave within 30 seconds before I go on television and still have a beard." The day after the debate, the Chicago Daily News ran the headline, "Was Nixon sabotaged by TV makeup artists?" Richard Daley, the all-powerful Democratic mayor of Chicago, said, "My God, they've embalmed him even before he died." Nixon lost the election to John F. Kennedy by 0.2% of the vote, 49.7% to 49.5%. In an election that close, every mistake matters. A mistake like not getting the makeup right was the kind of thing that infuriated Roger Ailes. Now, 7 years later, Ailes was meeting Nixon for the first time in the makeup room of the Mike Douglas show. At age 26, Ailes looked like an assistant, but he was the boss, the executive producer of the show, and Nixon was once again a presidential candidate in what was beginning to look like a crowded field covering the 1968 Republican nomination. Ailes wanted Nixon to be president, and he knew the most powerful force blocking Nixon's path to the White House was television. To win the White House in the 1960s, you had to understand and respect the power of television. Ailes also knew that one of Nixon's potential rivals for the Republican nomination understood everything about television, Ronald Reagan, the former film and TV actor. Ailes wondered what Nixon had learned about TV since the makeup disaster of the 1960 campaign. Sitting in the makeup chair, Nixon offhandedly mentioned to Ailes how silly it felt to try to reach voters by appearing on an afternoon talk show like this one instead of a news show like Meet the Press. The Mike Douglas show is targeted at housewives and usually populated by B-list showbiz celebrities. In response, Ailes instantly rattled off a list of every bad move Nixon had ever made on TV, and it was a long list. Ailes was a teenager when he'd seen some of these things. This was not the way people talked to former Vice President Richard Milhous Nixon. There was none of the deference Nixon had become accustomed to over the decades, and Nixon loved it. Nixon made Ailes an offer he couldn't refuse. Instead of trying to make Mike Douglas America's biggest afternoon TV star, make Richard Nixon America's next president. With Ailes on the media team, the Nixon campaign was ready to make the move from being the worst TV campaign to the best. "We're going to build this whole campaign around television," Nixon told his media team. "You boys just tell me what to do and I'll do it." Roger Ailes' career in Republican politics, which included every day he ran Fox News, turned out to be longer than Richard Nixon's. Ailes became more influential in Republican politics than Nixon ever was. We have reason to wonder who would be president today if Richard Nixon had not provoked Roger Ailes in the Mike Douglas show makeup room. Such are the seeds that were planted in American politics in the 1968 presidential campaign. "Run, Bobby, Run" is the subhead for the next part of this. Bobby was a natural on television. In 1967, he was the only potential presidential candidate who could charm a TV audience just by being himself. All he needed was his smile. Bobby was the Elvis of American politics, the only politician who didn't need a last name to identify him. But his last name was everything. It was Bobby Kennedy's last name that made every potential candidate fear him. As the field of candidates began to take shape in 1967, every campaign calculation depended on Bobby, even when he showed no signs of wanting to run, even when he told people he wasn't going to run. President Lyndon Baines Johnson feared Bobby to the point of obsession. Johnson thought Bobby was the only one who could do the unthinkable, challenge the incumbent president's grip on the Democratic nomination. Johnson was sure that Bobby was the only Democrat who might dare run against him. He was wrong. Nixon feared Bobby too, as did every Republican planning a campaign. Nixon knew exactly what to fear. He had lost to a Kennedy before. Losing to a Kennedy meant losing to the Kennedy political machine, and it meant losing it to the Kennedy style. A political machine can be beaten by a better political machine, though Nixon had never seen a better political machine than the Kennedys. Kennedy's style was something else. Nixon knew there was nothing Ailes could do for his image that could compete with Kennedy's style. Nixon couldn't change his sharply receding hairline. At 54, he was too old to do anything but tamp down his short, dark hair as flat as possible on his head. Bobby's hair had grown longer every year of the 1960s. Now at 42, he had the shaggiest hair in the United States Senate. His little brother Ted was the only other senator with a full head of hair. Bobby's hair was beginning to grow over his ears, rock musician length for the Senate then. And everywhere Bobby spoke outside the Senate chamber, he was treated like a rock star. That's what Nixon and Johnson feared most about Bobby, the way the crowds responded to him. They'd never seen anything like it in politics. Nixon and Johnson were both old enough to remember the first time anyone saw fans screaming and swooning for Frank Sinatra in the 1940s, before, during, and after every song Sinatra sang. America saw an even more intense version of that fan reaction when the Beatles landed in the United States in 1964. And now Nixon and Johnson saw a version of it happening to Bobby. Everywhere Bobby went, crowds worked themselves into frenzies. When he spoke, he didn't sound like any senator they'd heard before. His voice wasn't stiff and self-conscious. The book Playing with Fire by Lawrence O'Donnell.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And buenos dias, ¿cómo está usted? I think I've exhausted my Spanish vocabulary left over from studying it in second grade. Anyway, happy Cinco de Mayo. Just another amazing day here. We've got a lot on the program today. I want to talk about the death of democracy and how much is a human life worth, what Andrew Cuomo was just talking about on his daily fireside chat thing. It's a huge issue that really needs to be discussed. I want to get into a story about, from my life that I think is illustrating a real struggle that many of us have about dealing with, just emotionally dealing with all this stuff. In our second hour, I want to get into a deep dive into whether this overall economic disaster that has been caused by this coronavirus is going to be inflationary because the currency is being debased by all the work that the Fed is doing, or whether it's going to be deflation. And if it's inflationary, then we're looking at a major recession, like in the 1970s that hurt Jimmy Carter so badly with high interest rates and things. Or if it's going to be deflationary, like the Great Depression. And I'll tell you my opinion on all that. I have a very strong opinion on that. I'll share all that. And what do you do? What's your investment strategy? What's your living through it strategy? What's your survival strategy? How do we do that? That'll be our second hour. And in our third hour, Kevin Camps is going to drop by. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission has said that they are going ahead with a high-level radioactive waste dump in New Mexico, despite it being illegal. So we'll get to that in our third hour. And a whole bunch of other news as well that I'm going to kind of push into the third hour here. But I want to start out with this, how much is a life worth? Andrew Cuomo came out and said this on television this morning. And, Louise and I have had this conversation a couple of times. In fact, she just brought it up yesterday again of, where does all this, not where does all this go? How are they, making these decisions in the White House and in governors' offices and whatnot? Because we actually do make these decisions all the time. How much is a life worth? Ralph Nader busted GM and Ford over this back in the 70s because they concluded that if somebody died because of the side saddle gas tanks in the Chevy trucks or because of the Pinto and the Ford, the gas tank in the back, that if somebody dies, well, it's going to cost us about $250,000 or $500,000. I forget what the number was. I think it was $250,000 or $200,000 was their settlement. And now keep in mind, that would be $2 million in today's dollars. But they were like, that's what it's going to cost us. And so we'll save more than that on the 5-cent bolt kind of thing. The EPA makes these decisions. How many people will die if we increase or decrease, or not die if we decrease the level of fill in the blank of pollutant, atrazine or cyanide or, whatever it may be. And we have acceptable levels for poisons in our environment that we know kill people. We know that 10,000 people a year die just from air pollution from car exhaust. And in California, they said we want to reduce that number, and we're willing to raise the economic cost to do that. With catalytic converters first 20 years ago, and now with higher fuel standards. Whereas the rest of the Republican part of the country says no, and the Trump administration, no, we don't care about those people dying. We want the car manufacturers and the fossil fuel manufacturers to make more money, or refiners. So Cuomo was like, how much is a life worth? And I think that the Republicans have done the following math. You take $6 trillion, which is what the estimated cost so far, and you could argue that it's even $16 trillion because the Fed has pumped, or $10 trillion, excuse me, because the Fed has pumped $6 trillion into the big corporations, and Congress pumped about $2 trillion or about $3 trillion into big corporations out of that $4 trillion that's been appropriated. So that's $10 trillion. You take $10 trillion, and the new Trump projections are that roughly 150,000 people will die. I think it was 134,000. And so if you divide, 150,000 into 10 trillion, I can't do that math that fast in my head, but basically, you're going to come up with each life being worth, what, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars? And the Republicans are looking at this going, the majority of the people who are dying from this, more than half of the people who are dying from this are either elderly, poor, or black. And Republicans don't think that any of those lives are worth even, $100,000. I mean, look at the arguments they've made to scale back Medicare and Medicaid, or even forbid people from getting Medicaid in the red states. All those lives aren't worth that much. I think Cuomo nailed it. And then on top of that, you've got, and I'm wondering if you think so too, and do you think that this is, does this make sense, that this is the Republican math? And for that matter, should it be our math? I mean, is it acceptable? Apparently it is in Sweden. Is it acceptable to have, let's say that we completely open the country back up like Trump wants to do, so that he can have a roaring economy to get reelected in November? Is it acceptable to have 1 million deaths? And if you have 1 million deaths and it costs, and the damage, of preceding that was $6 trillion to the economy, that's still, whatever that works out to be, it's still a lot of money per family, per person. So, I think, Cuomo has opened the door to this conversation. I think it's an important conversation. And maybe you can do the math for me faster than I was able to do it. Meanwhile, Donald Trump says he will not sign any legislation to stimulate our economy if it doesn't include a massive cut in Social Security. I mean, a cut so large that it may well force the Social Security system into the same crisis that the post office is facing right now. This is the way Republicans tear down government. This is the way America-hating Republicans tear down government and replace it with big corporations. They want to tear down the post office. They've been tearing down the post office since 2005, or 2006, I guess it is. Tearing down the post office. They want to replace it with FedEx. And they want to tear down Social Security and replace it with Citibank and Wells Fargo and Bank of America. I mean, it's just that simple. He's not going to sign any more stimulus packages unless there's a huge cut in the Social Security tax, which funds Social Security. He calls it a payroll tax cut, but it's really a full-blown attack on Social Security itself. The Republican strategy is to replace government. Steve Bannon said, our goal is to dismantle the administrative state. What does that mean? Destroy American government. These guys hate America. They hate our government. They hate our values. The pluralistic, all men are created equal, all people are created equal, the values of the founders of this country. These Republicans hate these values. And they are doing everything they can to destroy this country. They cut the regulatory agencies. They cut the funding to like the EPA so that there's more poison in our environment. One of Trump's first pieces of legislation was to let the big coal mining companies and oil refining companies pour more fossil fuel waste into our rivers, knowing that that's going to be in the drinking water of millions and millions of children downstream who are going to be neurologically and developmentally damaged. They don't give a rat's ass. They hate America. They just want to extract all the cash they can out of us. Workplaces and residential areas near factories and toxic waste sites, they're sacrifice zones. And then they say, just let the big corporations take it over. This is the biggest attack on American democracy in my lifetime. And they are succeeding. They have succeeded in destroying the EPA's ability to regulate this country. They have succeeded in destroying the Interior Department's ability to protect our public lands. They have succeeded in kneecapping Social Security and Medicare to the point that it takes 2 years to get a Social Security disability claim processed. And the funds are all low on money. They have succeeded in kneecapping the IRS to the point that they're no longer auditing super rich people like Donald Trump. They have succeeded. Will they finally destroy American democracy altogether? What do you think? Pick up your calls after the break. I've also got a pile of news for you here, too. Stick around.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
I think the clue, a big clue to all this is what can be found in some of these protests. I'll share that with you after the break. And welcome back. Jared in Downingtown, Pennsylvania. Hey, Jared, what's on your mind today?
Hello, Tom. I think when we're talking about the U.S. government, we need to always remember that we're dealing with a government that isn't really working for the people anymore. I mean, it used to at least work for basic needs for the people. It was still always, structured for the wealthy, but it wasn't it wasn't a just Ayn Rand death cult that we currently have. But somewhere along the lines, America seems to have just diverged from just basic common sense of the planet, and we seem to have just taken capitalism to a almost crazy and insane form of it with this deregulation that's been going on for the last 40, 50, 60 years now. And I don't think Donald Trump gets a lot of blame for the policies that he's largely continued. I mean, he has done nothing, quote unquote, populist since getting in. In fact, all I've seen him do is cut our health care and cut EPA regulations, and I just feel like he just doesn't get enough blame for all this.
Oh, Americans aren't outraged. Well, that's because our media doesn't talk about it in these terms. It's all, they've normalized the whole thing. Oh, yeah, that's what Republicans do, yeah. Ever since Reagan, ever since 1981, this idea that government is the cause of our problems, not the vehicle to solve our problems, has been the principal mantra of the Republican Party. And, of course, if government is not the cause of the problem, if government is the cause of the problems, then you have to destroy government. These guys have been an anti-America Jeremiad ever since 1981, and they're still on it. This is the logical endpoint. This isn't some aberration.
And it's a self-feeding feedback loop, because if you cut government and make it not work, people are going to start hating government. Why? Because it's not working.
That's my point. Reagan laid this out. He laid out this strategy and called it starve the beast. You starve government of resources, then government starts functioning poorly. Then you point out government is functioning poorly, and offer a corporate alternative. This is what they've been doing since 1981.
And I just wish that there was some kind of way we could stop it. But honestly, I don't see this ever
The only
ending.
way we can stop this, Jared, is to overwhelmingly elect Democrats in November. Take back the Senate and give it a filibuster-proof majority, 60 Democrats, and I think that's possible. Maintain control of the House and increase the margin of Democratic representation. I think that's possible. And replace Donald Trump with Joe Biden. It's just that simple. I mean, or whoever the Democratic nominee is, if it gets tossed, to the convention, in this summer. But I'm betting it's going to be Biden. Jared, thank you for the call. This is becoming kind of political science 101 in my opinion. So anyway, share that with you. We'll be right back. Our 1-hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3-hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. We have a new video over at thomhartmann.com for the people who support our program, and it's an interesting one. The phrase, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, has a really interesting history. And the exploitation of that phrase and that history by right-wingers in 20th century America, or late 20th century America, now 21st century America, also has a fascinating and rather grim history. Just the general absurdity of the idea that somebody can lift themselves off the ground by reaching down and pulling on a strap on their boots. Just think about it for a second. But it's used. This is used as justification by right-wingers, particularly over the last 40 years since the Reagan Revolution, to say, poor people, their poverty is their own fault. Check it out. It's over at thomhartmann.com. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. I wanted to share another piece of this with you. Well, actually, I think I'll do that in the next hour. We'll do that for the second block of the next hour, because I wanted to share some of this news with you that basically backs up the assertion that I was making that what we are seeing right now is the climax of a 40-year campaign to destroy America by the Reaganistas and the billionaires who supported Reagan, they were multimillionaires back then, but they're billionaires now because of Reagan's policies for 40 years. The billionaires who supported Ronald Reagan, the billionaires who supported George W. Bush, and the billionaires who now support Donald Trump. They don't want American democracy. They don't want you to vote. They don't want you to be protected by federal agencies. They want to make sure that they are not inspected by the IRS. McConnell is now saying that no legislation is going to pass unless it includes a provision that says that you can't prosecute or sue, you cannot sue a billionaire or a big corporation if they make workplace decisions that put your life at risk. And mark my words, this will not be limited to the coronavirus. They're going to use the coronavirus as an excuse to say if you work in a meat packing plant and they speed up the line and you cut your hand off, you can't sue because they sped up the line, which would have produced the predictable result you cut your hand off. If you work in a refinery and they're letting loose benzene fill the air and you get cancer, you get leukemia, which is known to be caused by benzene, you can't sue anymore because, hey, coronavirus. Right? This is what Mitch McConnell is all about. And this is why he brought the Senate back. You know what they're doing now? They're confirming right-wing judges. That's literally all they're doing. Confirming right-wing judges and Trump's new intelligence guy who follows a bunch of QAnon people on Twitter. That's it. Yesterday or Saturday, there was a huge crowd in Boston. Well, huge, a couple hundred people. And just look at, this is the Boston Globe. Matt Stout from the Boston Globe documented this. Bob Brigham wrote it up for Raw Story. These people were saying, this is communism, and we don't want your shutdown anymore. These are the protesters, right? Where are they getting this? They're getting it from Rush Limbaugh on Fox News. Anyhow, it's not a pandemic. The reason why they're doing this is to turn the United States into the United Socialist States of America. That's what one of the protesters said. Well, that's what Charles Koch has been saying for years. That's what the right-wing billionaires are all saying. Yeah, we don't want no socialism. Let the poor people die. Screw them. The crowd chanted, "It's a hoax, it's a hoax, it's a hoax." And then later the crowd chanted, "Make America great again, make America great again." And cars were driving by with Trump signs. I mean, this is what we're confronting right now. And what's their plan? What is the Republican plan? Let people die. I've been saying this for at least 3 or 4 weeks, that the Trump plan is herd immunity. The Trump plan, actually, I think it even goes beyond that. The Trump plan is to say, so what? The highest risk factor for death with coronavirus is being over 60. So let them die. Their lives aren't worth that much anymore. They're at the end of their lives. They're on Social Security after all. We'll cut Social Security obligations. They're on Medicaid, and it's costing us a fortune. Let them die. We can cut the taxes on the billionaires again. That's their plan. Meanwhile, in Colorado, one of the guys who showed up for these protests, Bradley Bunn, 53, they found he was promoting the protests, actually, on social media, saying, bring assault rifles to this May 1st rally in Colorado. So the cops checked him out, and they found pipe bombs in his house. Brilliant. And meanwhile, the Republican, Martha McSally, and a couple of other Republicans, Representative Paul Gosar and Representative Debbie Lesko, were photographed, the three of them, all their faces crammed together, smiling for a selfie in front of Air Force One just about an hour ago. They're flying on Air Force One with Trump to Arizona for a rally, or what's going to be, it'll be called something else, but I'm telling you, it's a rally. And, people are all outraged on social media. Why aren't you wearing masks? Well, I'll tell you why they're not wearing masks. They're not wearing masks because they were tested. They're testing everybody who gets near the president. Anybody who gets on Air Force One has to get tested. They've got these rapid 15-minute tests at the White House. You don't have them anywhere else. They don't have them for Congress. And by the way, what do you want to bet that all the Republican senators got this test, and it was paid for by anonymous billionaires, and that they're not telling their Democratic colleagues? I'd bet $50 on that if I was a betting man. I mean, I'm guessing a week or 2 weeks from now, particularly as Democrats start getting sick, if that's what happens, or people on their staff, you're going to hear stories about how the Republicans all had tests. Anyhow, Trump is continuing his cover-up on all this stuff. Not only has he blocked Fauci and Birx from testifying, not before the House. Not only has he blocked Mike Pence from testifying before the House, but today he blocked Seema Verma, the Medicare and Medicaid Services Director, and HHS Secretary Alex Azar. Why? Well, he says the Democrats are Trump haters, so nobody can testify before the House. This was the same approach he took with the impeachment, with the whole Russia, is he colluding with Russia thing, and it actually worked for him. I fully expect this one to work too. This is incredible. Anyhow, we'll be back with your calls right after this. Stick around. It's 28 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Is this how democracy dies? Stick around. We'll be right back. Book Club today, we're reading from Ralph Nader's new book, How the Rats Reformed the Congress, a fable. It's fiction. Chapter 1, Invader. It was one of those uncomfortable morning strategy sessions with his senior staff. For House Speaker Reginald Blamer, the discomfort was in having to figure ways to continue blocking a long overdue raise in the federal minimum wage for many millions of low-income workers when he knew in his gut it was not the right thing to do. We're in the crosshairs, he would say, starting such congressional meetings in his spacious office.
Not that his anxiety would cause him to renege on the implicit promise he had made to the big boys to stop the move in Congress to raise the minimum. But there was still background anxiety. After all, politicians are only human, and like many, Speaker Blamer came from a large family that had lived through tightened circumstances. His father was a tavern keeper and his mother a seamstress. Deep anxiety, however, did have one inherent comfort at such morning gatherings. It tended to work in mysterious ways to overcome his morning constipation, the constant bane of the Speaker's existence. Holding down 30 million workers, including among them many conservative voters who, when adjusted for inflation, were making less today than workers in 1968, bothered the very private, self-censored, psychosomatic recesses of the Speaker's conscience. And so, not surprisingly, Speaker Blamer felt the onset of a solid bowel movement. He excused himself and repaired to his large private bathroom. As he sat down in the broad porcelain toilet, he felt that the expected discharge would be ample and prompt. No straining today. After quick breaks of wind, the Speaker heard a sound inside the toilet, but it wasn't from his bowels. Lifting himself up a bit, he looked down and saw the head of a mostly submerged black rat closely eyeing his bottom. "Yow, yow, yow," bellowed the Speaker as he straightened up and slammed the cover down. Alarmed, the staff rushed to the bathroom door to respectfully call, "Speaker Blamer, are you all right? Do you need help?" They dared not open the door. The Speaker did not tolerate any exposure of his privacy, especially being seen in his corpulent native suit. Another more normal person might have replied, "Yeah, I'm okay, it's just that there's a rat in the toilet bowl." But Speaker Blamer was not a normal person. He has had to be super cunning to get to his present situation in life. Being cunning means that you can instantly sense danger, being as alert as, say, a rat. And Speaker Blamer was already imagining the deriding headlines in the late-night show jokes if he disclosed what really prompted his impulsive cries of sheer terror as he leapt from the throne. So he replied, "Nothing much, boys, just one of those sudden spasms I get once in a while. Sure comes on fast, it goes away fast, too. I'll be right out." Rejoining the staff at the head of the conference table, albeit full of gas and undischarged wastes, the Speaker went through the checklist for crushing the hopes of the downtrodden multitudes. His chief of staff reviewed the usual elements of the campaign against workers. First off, the Speaker will say, "I always thought that if you raise the price of anything, you get less of it. The proposal to raise the minimum wage is a job killer." "Good soundbite," said his research assistant. The Speaker nodded gravely, but when he heard the word bite, he silently winced. The operations assistant counted off the usual reliable economics professors who could supply objective warnings about losses of jobs in recession. The Fast Food and Big Box Retailer Association had begun a large ad buy on television and radio with the announcers' stentorian voices of dire gravity. The K Street lobbyists were already in action on Capitol Hill, marshaling the corporate PACs to make sure this drive was on the front burner, hinting to legislators that their employers might see this as a litmus test for their donations. Op-eds, letters to the editors, and editorial condemnation of economically disruptive higher wages and layoffs was already in the pipeline. About to burst, the Speaker could not wait to end the meeting. "Okay, fellows, you seem to have the situation well in hand. It's not the first time we had to fight off this wage grab. Get to work." They all scattered, including an irrelevant intern who wondered to herself whether paying members of Congress would mean the government would end up with less of them. Paying members of Congress more, excuse me. The moment the door to his spacious office closed, the Speaker literally lunged to his private toilet, whereupon he unloaded a vast quantity of feces, soft and semi-hard, 3 bursts worth. Before he could enjoy a moment of quiet satisfaction, a shrill shriek lifted him up as his eyes bulged. It was the black rat swimming in the bowl, propelling the terrified cry, "Yow, yow, yow." Again, he slammed down the toilet seat, kept his hand on the flush toilet handle, gritting his teeth as if to say, "On the way to oblivion, you dirty rat." His longtime secretary heard his yell and rushed to his bathroom. Mr. Speaker, what happened? Are you okay?" Recovering his composure, he replied, "I'm okay, Sarah, just more of those sudden spasms. I've got to get some physical therapy. By the way, did you schedule that fundraiser next week for an hour later?" "Yes, I did, Mr. Speaker," Sarah replied, sounding very relieved. Arriving home that early evening, he sat down to a healthy diet supper prepared by his adoring wife, Regina. Their 3 children were grown up, living in distant states, so they were empty nesters. "You seem unusually agitated, honey," said Regina. "Did you have a hard day?" "It seems every day is hard in these times," he replied, shrugging off her concern. "What a great meal always, Regina. Now I need some relaxing reading. Do you know where we put that colorful book of animals that we got as a wedding gift, anniversary gift, years ago?" "Why, yes, Reginald. It came in 3 volumes, mammals, reptiles, and insects. Tell me which one you want, and I'll get it for you." "Mammals," he replied. Sitting in his study, the Speaker started reading about the rat. The word rat is derived from the Latin rodere, which means to gnaw. Rats produce litter several times a year with high infant mortality. If seen as weak, newborns are eaten by their parents and their stronger siblings. Over the centuries, rats have developed uncanny abilities to survive dangers everywhere, especially those produced by their close proximity to humans, whose detritus and garbage ironically provide the means by which they prosper and create new nests. Rats live everywhere, underground, in sewers, in buildings, etc. Ralph Nader.
In Geeky Science, don't miss the 7 things that happen when you stop eating meat or eat less meat during this pandemic. And our fact of the week is about plummeting wildlife and extinctions. Check out The Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Just a couple of quick things before I pick up your calls. Marcos Molitsas wrote a great piece over on Daily Kos. It's titled, Why We Shouldn't Worry About Elizabeth Warren's Senate Seat. I tweeted it out to several people who said, well, the problem with Warren is that, you lose a Democratic seat in the Senate because, Massachusetts has a Republican governor, Charlie Baker. Well, the fact of the matter is in 2004, when John Kerry was running for president, he had that seat in the Senate. I'm not sure it was that exact seat because there's 2 of them in Massachusetts. I'd have to go back and look. But in any case, he was the senator from Massachusetts, and Massachusetts had a Republican governor. I believe it was Mitt Romney at the time. And so the Massachusetts legislature, which is overwhelmingly controlled by Democrats. I mean, right now, the Senate in Massachusetts is 34 Democrats to 4 Republicans, and the House is 126 Democrats to 31 Republicans. So what they did in 2004 is they changed the law. They said regardless of the party of the governor has to pick somebody, who is of the same party as the person leaving. So if you're going to replace John Kerry, Mitt Romney, if you're going to replace John Kerry, Governor Romney, you have to pick another Democrat. They actually changed the law in Massachusetts in 2004, and everybody was like, oh, that's cool. And then they changed it back in 2009 after Ted Kennedy died when Deval Patrick, who was a Democrat, was the governor. They said, well, we don't need this law anymore. I'm not sure if they changed it back or they let it expire, but in any case, now it's just up to the governor. But in 2004, it was up to the governor, but he had to pick a Democrat. Well, they could easily change that law again. They overwhelmingly control the Boston House and Senate. And if they did, frankly, I think Charlie Baker would be happy about that. He's a Republican who has really taken on his own party. I mean, he's spoken out about against Trump's travel ban. He's spoken out against Trump's immigration policy. He refused to endorse Trump in 2016. He's refusing to endorse him now. He has been smuggling personal protective equipment into the state. He joined the region's multi-state coronavirus planning compact, the only Republican to do so. So this is not rocket science. We don't have to lose a Democratic Senate seat if Elizabeth Warren becomes the VP choice and in November wins the election and has to resign from her Senate seat. We don't have to lose it as a Democratic seat. No problem. Oh, and if you don't think that this is all, it's all about the money, Frontier Airlines is now saying, hey, you want that middle seat next to you empty? Pay extra. They're calling them more room seats. I'm surprised they're not calling them freedom seats. After all, everything you put the word freedom on, you can charge more money for. It's amazing. Anyhow, Trace in West Palm Beach, Florida. Hey, Trace, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Thanks for constantly being ahead of the curve on everyone else in this throughout this entire thing. I just wanted to ask, two questions. One, I don't know if you tweeted something about yesterday going after the Lincoln Project ad and then all this stuff. And he was
melting down. The Lincoln Project, for people who don't know what you're talking about, Trace, is headed up in part and was co-founded by Kellyanne Conway's husband, George. And they just ran an ad that basically said Trump is a failure. He's failing at leadership. He's failing, with tens of thousands of dead Americans. And Trump went on a rage tweet binge about it last night and called him moonface. Which is typically a slur against people of Asian ancestry. And sure enough, George Conway is half Filipino. Anyhow, back to you, Trace.
So he he tweeted this thing out, and he touted the fact that he lowered taxes to an all-time low. But anyone with a brain is going to realize we were already in the middle of a great economy. Now the economy's in shambles. There's nothing left to stimulate it. I mean, it's not rocket science that decision is proving to be a bad decision very quickly, and he's so short-sighted that he continues to tout that. So that was my first. I mean, is it beyond?
Here's what you're missing, Trace. Here's what you're missing. For the first, from November when Trump first, or the Trump administration first learned about this virus, circulating in China, from November through December and January and February and the first week or so of March, the official position, the Trump position of the Trump administration was, don't worry, be happy, keep the economy going. We don't care what's going to happen. Then when people started dying in droves and the doctors started showing up on TV with tears in their eyes and people were being stored in refrigerated trucks outside hospitals, then Trump had to act. And so he listened to his doctors. He listened to Birx and Fauci, who said, we've got to save lives, or at the very least, we've got to save the hospitals. We've got to flatten the curve so that our emergency rooms and our ICUs are not overwhelmed. And so, let the deaths trickle in rather than come in as a flood. And so Trump said, okay, and he declared a national emergency and recommended social distancing and all this kind of stuff. Well, the social distancing actually has a big effect. And even in states that didn't put it into place, people are not showing up. They're not going shopping. They're being very careful. And so the curve started to flatten nationwide. And so now he's saying, okay, step 2, how much is a human life worth? Well, it's certainly not worth millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions, which is when you divide the number of dead people by the economic damage, what we're looking at. So we're going to go back to saying, hey, it's no problem if a couple 100,000 people die. In fact, if 1 million people die, that's no problem because most of them are going to be old or black or poor if they're white. And those are people that, Republicans just don't give a damn about, frankly. So, that's the thing that I think you're missing there, Trace. Look at I mean, right. This is the arc of this whole thing.
Right. No, you're on point. But if states start to open one by one, and you have some states remaining at placing an emphasis on social distancing, isn't that sort of like having a smoking section in an airplane?
Yeah, or a peeing section in a swimming pool. Yeah, which is the metaphor I was using last week. You're absolutely right, and this is a problem. It's not such a big problem right now because people aren't traveling interstate. The airlines are shut down. But it will become a big problem when the economy starts coming back. Here in Oregon, we've had no deaths in the last 2 days. We're, in Multnomah County, which is Portland, which is, the majority of the population of Oregon, I think, or at least the largest population center. We have had not only no deaths, but, I think yesterday we had something like, 14 or 11 new cases. The day before that was 14. I mean, we're way down from 30s and 40s a day, just a couple of weeks ago. It's working here. Just like it's working in Hong Kong. Hong Kong hasn't had a death in several days. They've crushed the curve. New Zealand thinks that they can become virus-free within the next few weeks. Australia is moving in that direction. Taiwan, same deal. So basically, the blue states are adopting the Asian model, the New Zealand, Australia, Hong Kong, Taiwan model. And the red states are adopting the Swedish model, which is, have 3 or 4 times as many people die as everybody else, but they're going to be mostly old people and poor people. And, they're not worth damaging our economy over. And right. Frankly, one of those 2 models is probably going to win out at the end of the day. And I'm guessing it's going to be the Trump-Sweden model when all is said and done. But we'll see. We'll see. Trace, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. Stimulating conversation, shall we say. Virginia in New Hope, Alabama. Hey, Virginia, what's up?
Hi, sweetie. I'd like to ask you about a question, something that I heard a couple of days ago. It was a message that Putin supposedly sent out to the other world leaders that America had lost its standing on the world stage as being a leader. And
yeah, Putin said that several months ago. China said that last week.
Didn't China send a message to troops who needed to worry about his sick soldiers?
I don't know.
I thought
Well,
I had
what
heard
was your
that.
point, Virginia?
Well, this has what's going on now has exposed all our weaknesses. They see the long food lines, the amount of people that are going week to week to paycheck, and the divide that we have here in America. And with the president claiming complete power, then that to me looks like a dictatorship, totalitarian, or fascist type government.
I think you're right. I think we are in the twilight days of American democracy. And it's either going to be completely crushed by Donald Trump and his billionaire buddies. It's going to be completely crushed and he wins the election. And that's the end of American democracy. And we slide into full-blown fascism at this time next year. Either that's going to happen or the anti-American movement, the Republican Party's hate America movement, is going to be crushed at the ballot box in November, and we're going to get a new FDR kind of president, or God, hopefully, God willing, and we will have a new renewal in America, like we did 80 years ago or 100 years ago when this happened. 80 years ago when this happened in the 1930s and 40s. So, and 80 years before that when it happened in the 1860s, 1870s. So we'll see. But Virginia, you raise a very, very good point, and thank you very much for doing so and for watching us on Facebook Live. It's 45 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls and the news of the day in just a moment. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And if you don't think this is turning into an all-out culture war, check this out. Michigan man walks up to a person in a store and says, "I'll use this mask," wipes his nose on the worker's uniform. And welcome back. Margot in Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin. Hey, Margot, what's up?
Oh, Tom, I agree with everything. And I loved Virginia's comments. Mm-hmm. I think we're like the frog they put in the slow boiling water. The American people have been slow boiled. Well, now it's coming to our democracy. I'm sorry, I am so upset about this government and the Republican senators that didn't vote to remove him from office. The man is not right, and as we fought, and I believe in the American people, oh God, please make me believe that in November we're going to get that crud and his corrupt government out. But people need to wake up. But we've been struggling for so long, being underpaid and struggling, that who has time to watch? I'm retired, so I can watch your show, and I can watch Stephanie Miller and get a laugh in the morning. But it's so tough. But they need to wake up as Americans, and we help each other all the time. I've watched during this crisis American people step up and honor the people, that are saving lives. Do we get tested? I don't think so. But you bet everybody in the White House is getting tested all the time. And his slam dunk moronic show in front of Abraham Lincoln, I mean, that was disgusting.
Yep, I agree.
I mean, honest to God, when do we wake up? This is our country. It's we the people.
Yeah.
It's we the people.
Go ahead, Margot.
Oh, I'm sorry, but they took an oath. It's we the people. I've not seen that we the people from the Republicans.
And it hasn't been since 1981.
I'm outraged. I am totally outraged. We need to wake up. And in November, even though they keep trying to suppress our votes, and I'm from Wisconsin, I marched up to my polling place. I didn't care if I got the COVID-19. I was going to vote. That's my God-given right. And many men and women have died through the years to have that gift.
You're absolutely right. Margot, I got to run, but thank you. Thank you for being so clear and articulate in what you're saying there. It's just, you laid it out. And the question that you asked, I'm going to attempt to answer right after this little bump music thing here, which is, when do we wake up? Stick around. We'll be right back. Did you know that Ronald Reagan committed treason to become president in 1980 and George Herbert Walker Bush was in on it and he avoided being prosecuted for this in 1992 with a little help from Bill Barr? It's on page 116 of my book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. 10 minutes before the hour, welcome back. Margot from Wisconsin was just asking this question, and I want to try to answer it. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well, and we can extend this conversation into the next hour, although I've got a couple of pretty good rants and a lot of news for you to open the next hour. But in any case, she asked the question, when do we as a country wake up? You know, I briefly teased this story as we were hitting the break about this guy in Michigan who walked into a store and the greeter at the store said, "Sir, you have to wear a mask." And he walked over to the greeter who was wearing a mask and grabbed a piece of her uniform and wiped his nose on it and said, "I guess I'll use this as my mask." And then he ran out of the store and escaped in a van, and they're trying to find him based on the footage. But they've got you can see this. It's all over the internet. You can see the footage of this guy walking up and wiping his nose on this person. I mean, when do we wake up to what's going on here? When do we wake up to the destruction of our democracy? When do we wake up to how sick and pathological what's going on is? This Faustian bargain that Trump is making with the billionaires about how many Americans are going to die in exchange for reopening the economy. And I think I have an answer to that. Right now, we have an infection rate across the United States. You know, we've got 3 million cases that we know of in the United States. Let's say, we're moving in, closing in on 4 million cases that we know. Well, let's stay with 3 million because there's 330 million Americans. So if you've got 3 million cases and there's 330 million people, we're about 1%. So in reality, probably about 2% of America, maybe 3% of America, if you consider all the silent infections and everything else, the asymptomatic people out there are infected. And a small percentage of those people are going to have somebody who is old or poor or in poor health in their family who's going to die from this. So the deaths right now are affecting probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 1% to 2% of American families. Now, it's regional. If you live in New York City, or particularly if you live in Crown Heights or New Rochelle, then, the odds are probably more like 5 or 10% of the people there have somebody in their family who died. But in the red states, it's probably 1/10 of 1% of the people have somebody in their family who has died from this. And I'm of the opinion that things don't get real for Americans until it affects them personally. So the shutdown has gotten real for people. You've got, 30% unemployment right now. Or at least 20%. We're at Great Depression levels of unemployment. So pretty much everybody has somebody in their family or somebody that they know who has been hurt by the shutdown. And so that rage is spreading across the country very rapidly. And in those states, like I was listening to Oregon Public Radio this morning, and they were talking about how, there's this huge reopen the economy movement in Oregon, and the argument that these people are making, and they're making it, some of them are state legislators, the argument that they're making is, we've had no deaths in 2 days here in Oregon. So why don't we open the economy back up? And what they're missing, of course, is that the reason we've had no deaths is because the economy's closed. But it's going to hit a point where governors can't resist that pressure anymore. They have fewer deaths because they're being successful. It's only, here in Oregon, it's probably affecting 0.1% of families have had somebody die or get sick from this in a way that would scare them. But if we open the economy back up here, it's going to go from 1% to 5 or 6% or 7 or 8% or even 10%. Look at Italy. Look at Spain. Look at Hubei province in China. And when that happens, I think that Americans will wake up. It seems like the threshold is probably going to be 5 or 10%. When 5 or 10% of American families have a family member who has died, a young person who has died from a stroke or heart attack caused by COVID, an older person who has died from the lung disease caused by COVID, a member of their family who is obese, which seems to be the second largest. The risk factors are number 1, being over 60, number 2, being obese, number 3, having high blood pressure, which tends to track old age. So, and then number 4, you get into things like diabetes. And there's a lot of people in America. A third of this country is overweight, is obese. So it's going to start hitting families, and it's going to start hitting young people. And as it does, I think Americans are going to start saying, oh, wait a minute. And the question is, if Trump had maintained the social distancing all through the summer, so the death rates were really low and most families weren't affected, he probably could have gotten to the election day blaming the bad economy on Democrats and public health officials, saying, see, very few deaths, we protected the country, now re-elect me and I'll put everything back together. That would have been his best strategy. It's sort of like what Nixon did with the Vietnam War in 1972. See, it's getting better. But instead, he thinks he has to have the economy right now, so he wants to reopen the economy. Well, reopening the economy, and it's happening in the red states, is going to cause an explosion of deaths, which is going to cause people to say, whoa, wait a minute, my grandpa just died. My obese brother-in-law just died. And at that point, they're going to start thinking, I might die. And I think that this is going to happen by October, November, September, October, November, because there's about a 3-month lag from the time that people are initially exposed, look at January, February here in the United States, to the time that people start dropping like flies, March, April. And that was in big cities, in blue state, in Seattle and they didn't drop like flies because Jay Inslee stepped in very, very quickly. But New York State, de Blasio and Cuomo kind of procrastinated, and boom, they got hit. They got nailed. Well, that's what's going to happen in the red states. And when that happens in the red states, I'm of the opinion that it's really going to start collapsing around Donald Trump. And the question at that point is, okay, when he's really freaking out this fall, as the second wave comes, is he going to start a war? My apologies to all the folks on hold. This is the time we usually take your calls, but I just wanted to get that rant out. We're going to continue into the next hour. Is this going to be inflationary or deflationary? How do we plan for this? What are the politics of this? Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
We have a new video over at thomhartmann.com for the people who support our program, and it's an interesting one. The phrase, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, has a really interesting history, and the exploitation of that phrase and that history by right-wingers in 20th century America, or late 20th century America, now 21st century America, also has a fascinating and rather grim history. Just the general absurdity of the idea that somebody can lift themselves off the ground by reaching down and pulling on a strap on their boots. I mean, just think about it for a second. But it's used, this is used as justification by right-wingers, particularly over the last 40 years since the Reagan Revolution, to say, oh, poor people, their poverty is their own fault. Check it out. It's over at thomhartmann.com.
Our book today is Future War, Preparing for the New Global Battlefield by Robert, I believe it's pronounced Latif, L-A-T-I-F-F. This is from the introduction. On a sweltering August day following weeks of heightened tension with Russia over its actions in Ukraine and Syria, and harsh words between the United States and China over actions in the South China Sea, and as workers are preparing to depart the cool of their air-conditioned Manhattan office buildings for the gridlocked highways and subways, several large electric power plants along the East Coast simultaneously experienced dramatic overspeed conditions in their large turbine generators. Plant operators are unable to stop the steam turbines, whose automatic control and data systems have been infected by sophisticated computer malware, and they catastrophically tear themselves apart, cutting power to large segments of the population and industries in the Northeast. Building systems shut down, hospitals switch to emergency generators, trains stop running, traffic lights cease operating, and Wall Street trading comes to a halt. At the same time, 1,100 miles to the south, a massive rocket sits fueled and ready to launch a critical national security satellite when an explosive-laden private aircraft flies at low altitude into the Cape Canaveral launch pad area and, despite repeated warnings, slams into the pressurized fuel tank and solid rocket motors, creating an enormous conflagration. Half a world away, elite commandos equipped with the latest high-technology equipment but unidentifiable as a national army attack U.S. and allied interests near areas of disputed territory. Thus are fired the opening shots of a new war. These hypothetical events represent a radically different style of conflict fought with new tools and against new and unfamiliar enemies. When most people think of war, they imagine soldiers doing battle with other soldiers, employing tanks, artillery, and other recognizable weapons. However, in this century, war has morphed into something we can scarcely recognize, and future conflicts will be qualitatively and quantitatively unlike those of the past. They will be fought using innovative and unusual weapons, many of which, because the technologies have both civilian and military uses, will be available to far more people who are far less skilled in their employment. The so-called democratization of technology has diminished the monopoly of advanced countries on the tools of war. 21st century armed conflicts often have no battlefield in the traditional sense. The concept of opposing armies clashing in deadly struggle but moderated by international conventions of behavior seems a thing of the past. In 1999, Chinese colonels Kuo Liang and Wang Shuangshui predicted that soldiers would increasingly be computer hackers, financiers, drug smugglers, and agents of private corporations rather than members of a military, and that their weapons would include not only airplanes, cannons, poison gas bombs, and biochemical agents, but also computer viruses, net browsers, and financial derivative tools. Their predictions were prescient. Yesterday's wars were, like World War II, about saving civilized nations from maniacal dictators, or like the conflicts in Vietnam and Korea, devoted to a clash of ideologies in the attempt to limit the spread of one hegemon over another. They were big affairs involving large military forces and enormous violence. Today's wars are more about cultural and religious hatreds, using violence as a means to change the hearts and minds of people, among whom the killing occurs with more frequency. Tomorrow's wars will be different still, fought largely for political dominance with stealth and cunning, targeting innocents and institutions, heavily dependent on information superiority and employing strange new weapons. While we have a highly motivated and well-trained and equipped armed forces that will adapt, we are not prepared as a nation to react well to the inevitably messy and ambiguous situations these new conflicts and weapons will present. We still have no clear idea of what constitutes an act of war in cyberspace now, nor of how we might respond to such an act. It is not enough for the military to be prepared. Neither the public nor its decision makers have yet fully comprehended the significance of the changes in the types of conflict and the tools with which they will be fought. Without question, there will be circumstances when decision makers will find it necessary, or at least think it necessary, to send soldiers into classic boots-on-the-ground combat situations. We will continue to project force with our powerful aircraft, our munitions, and our aircraft carrier strike groups. When war is fought in foreign lands, it could well be against other high-tech armies. However, war will increasingly be more personal and often fought closer to home. It will not lend itself to the traditional massive displays of U.S. firepower. It will affect individuals directly, not as some distant conflict we read about in newspapers or watch in the movies or on the internet. Americans will be targeted on U.S. soil, often, as we have seen in San Bernardino and Orlando, by homegrown terrorists. This form of war will be messy and complex, and it will not lend itself to easy, quick, soundbite solutions. It may not even be clear for a while who perpetrated the violence against us. Was it state-sponsored or a random act of terror? Will we unleash massive destruction on foreign countries in retaliation for attacks by terrorists residing on our own soil? If so, to what end and with what consequences? There are always consequences, whether they be the death or capture of our own troops, unnecessary civilian casualties, or the incitement of more violence. The book Future War by Robert Latif.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
So when you have a pandemic, there's basically two ways to respond to it. One is to minimize deaths, particularly a pandemic that strikes disproportionately old people, people in poor health. You either protect those people and harm your economy, slow down your economy over a period of time, number one, which seems to be the big debate in America. Actually, it's not even protect those people. You try to protect everybody because eventually everybody knows somebody who's old or in poor health and they will transmit the virus to them. So either you do that or you just say, you know, these people are expendable. We'll just let them die. And we're going to keep our economy rolling along. Now, there's a third way that has not been adopted by the United States. You have several blue states that are trying to adopt it, but they're getting such pressure that they're kind of cracking under that pressure. Gavin Newsom in California, Governor Kate Brown here in Oregon, both have backed out of, they're relaxing the restrictions, right? Piece by piece by piece. This is happening in blue states all across the country because the pressure is so great. And understandably, you know, Cuomo today on TV was talking about how in New York, suicides are up, substance abuse is up, spousal abuse is up, you know, domestic violence is up. All things that could have been predicted. How do we quantify the cost of that versus the cost of the economy versus the cost to the people? And how does this play out? So there's like all these pieces to this. But this third way, this is what Hong Kong has done. They've said, you know, we don't want to have the virus here at all. Hong Kong is reopening right now. Why? Because they don't have the virus. You know, Wuhan has reopened. They don't have the virus. And if anybody pops up with the virus, they aggressively quarantine them and do social distancing and do contact tracing and all that kind of stuff. Hong Kong right now has recorded 4 days straight of not a single new case. And 6 of the last 10 cases have seen 0 additional cases. And all of the new cases came from people who traveled to Hong Kong from someplace else. All of them. In fact, they have reached such a low transmission rate that they can no longer calculate the transmission time. You know, that R naught number? If it's 1, it means that every person infects one person. 1.1 means the infection is spreading. One person infects 1.1 people. 0.9 means the infection is starting to collapse, which means one person only infects 0.9 people. I mean, this is how you calculate population growth, by the way. Same thing. These numbers have been, this model has been around forever. Human population growth. But they can't even estimate it anymore in Hong Kong because they have so few cases. Iceland, same thing. They now have 1,799 confirmed cases. 10 people have died in the entire country. At their peak, which was a month ago, they were getting 106 people a day, new cases. Now it's 0. Iceland, an island nation. Now, Hong Kong's not an island. I mean, Hong Kong Island is an island, but Kowloon is considered, part of Hong Kong, I believe. I believe it still is. So, you've got that. Which raises another interesting question, which is, how is this going to play out economically? All this, both the damage to the economy on the one hand, and the response of the Fed printing $6 trillion in the last couple of months on the other hand. When the Fed prints money, that's inflationary. That reduces the value of the dollar. When economic activity slows down, that's deflationary. That makes the dollar worth more and drives down both prices and wages. Just to set the table here. Inflation is when it takes more dollars to buy the same thing, so the dollar has a lower value. So you see prices going up, and really hyperinflation is where prices are literally going up every day. People go shopping every day because they know the next day the price is going to go on up. The big imperative during real serious inflation is not having money. Turn all your money, because money is rapidly declining in value, turn all your money into things. Buy houses, buy cars, buy art, buy gold, buy collectibles, whatever it may be, in inflation. Move your money out of dollars into something. But during deflation, you want to get as many dollars as you can. You want to sell the house, you want to sell the car, you want to sell the art and the collectibles and the gold and everything else, because the value of dollars is increasing faster than everything else. So you want to convert everything you can into dollars. Those are the basic strategies for surviving inflation and deflation. And you could build a case for this happening in either direction. You could say, they're debasing the dollar. And in fact, there are some hedge fund. This is two of the world's largest hedge funds. Paul Singer's Elliott Management, Singer the Vulture, and what Greg Pallas calls him, and Andrew Law's Caxton Associates, and Danny Young's Diamond Asia Capital. They're all betting on inflation, and they're investing in gold. They're betting that the value of the dollar is going to go down, and therefore the price of gold will go up. And they have put $40 billion into this. So they're betting that the government, pulled the trigger the wrong way. On the other hand, I think you could build a very strong case for deflation, that what is coming now is that, and we're seeing this in the early reports, out of Austin, Texas, fascinating report out of Austin, Texas. Governor Abbott opened the malls this weekend, and nobody is coming. You get these pictures of these malls, and there's like 12 people walking around. He opened restaurants. How many people in the restaurants? 2 or 3. People are still afraid to come out of their houses, with good reason. I mean, this virus kills young people. We've got, 30 some odd thousand unexplained deaths from heart attacks and strokes in the United States, way above what you would normally have during this time. And you can't explain them all by stress. The probability is that the vast majority of them are COVID-19 that wasn't diagnosed because they weren't showing as lung symptoms. They weren't showing as pneumonia. And now they're thinking that even the pneumonia in COVID, what's causing people to crash so rapidly is that the blood clotting starts going crazy. And what's happening is not that they're getting an opportunistic viral or bacterial infection in their lungs, but instead that their lungs are shutting down because the arteries that are feeding the lungs and the veins that are bringing the blood back out of the lungs into the circulatory system are getting all clogged up with blood clots, including in some of the major blood vessels. So, people are hiding out. And that word is spreading. By the way, Fox News has a story about this on their website right now. Sean Hannity yesterday was saying, don't show up with weapons when you protest. I think, frankly, the lawyers at Fox News have had a talk with the talent and said, we don't really want to be on the receiving end of a lawsuit for inciting to riot. And if somebody shows up at one of these events that you guys have been pushing and they shoot somebody, you're going to be the ones held responsible. And Hannity is starting to back off. As I said, Fox News carrying this story on their website, foxnews.com. So that, in my opinion, argues for deflation, and I think that's what we're going to see. You've got when you have a quarter to a third of the workplace unemployed, those people are desperate. They'll work for anything. So you're going to see $15 an hour jobs become $10 an hour jobs. You're going to see $10 an hour jobs become $8 an hour jobs. You're going to see $8 an hour jobs become $7.50 an hour jobs, which is the federal minimum wage. And you're going to see a lot of jobs paying less than $7.50 an hour, but doing it in cash under the table. And when people have less money because wages are going down, they're going to spend less money. And when they spend less money, guess what's going to happen? Prices are going to collapse to get people to buy things. And as prices collapse, companies can't afford to pay their workers. And so they reduce wages. And this is called a deflationary spiral. It's what happened in the United States from December of 1929 all the way into arguably mid-1934. And I think we're on the precipice of it. What do you think? How is this going to play out in your mind?
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with more of this. Oh, and I got to tell you about the geese and the dogs after this break. And welcome back. What a day, huh? Steve in Topanga, California. Hey, Steve, what's on your mind today? Thanks for watching Free Speech TV.
Hey, Tom. I was thinking that progressives need to put their own Powell memo together on hyperspeed. And then I think Biden should do something like that, put some proposals out there, and we need long-term education. I've been read your hidden history books, and I really got a lot out of them, and now I'm on the crash of 2016. And I think that's the only way we're going to get anywhere is through re-educating the population, because I was educated in the 60s pretty much, and I don't think the schools we're not learning critical thinking anymore. What do you think about that?
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right, Steve, and that's what I'm trying to do with this program. And I believe that other progressives, Randy Rhodes and Stephanie Miller and Mike Malloy and all the others out there are trying to do as well. And the problem is that the corporate media is trying to go down the middle, in quotes, and the middle has shifted so far to the right that going down the middle means being like, I guess, Richard Nixon. So it's a tough one. But I'm with you. I'm absolutely.
Last thing I want to say is I think that you could write something like the Powell memo for the progressives. I think that would be in good hands if you took that on.
In a way. Well, I was going to say my book, Cracking the Code, is that, but actually I think Rebooting the American Dream is that. I wrote a book that's got 10 or 11 chapters, and each one is a specific policy prescription. One on free education, one on health care, one on dealing with trade. In fact, it opens with dealing with trade. That's the first chapter, ending so-called free trade. So I've already written, in fact, Bernie wrote a cover letter saying you got to read this book, and gave a copy of it to all 99 other senators when that book came out. It came out about 6 years ago, but it's still in print, and it's called Rebooting the American Dream, and it's my version of the Powell memo. Thanks a lot for the call, Steve. Horace in High Point, North Carolina. Hey, Horace, what's on your mind?
How you doing, Tom? I have a ticket that the Democrats should run, and it's impossible to beat. Biden should pick Michelle Obama. Once he's inaugurated, he resigns. That makes Michelle the president. Then she can pick whoever she wants for vice president. That'll put Obama back in the White House again for 8 years. Without question, they could never beat that ticket.
Yeah, probably not, but don't discount the power of white racism. And with Michelle Obama, you've got a twofer. You'd have white men who don't think women should be in politics as well. But I think that I love Michelle Obama, and I think that the problem is she has never been an elected official before. And
that's okay.
And also, I don't think she has any interest in doing this.
Two things I understand is humility and good common sense. The lady has both.
She has both.
She is an excellent speaker, and there is no way that the Republicans could ever beat that ticket. No way.
Yeah. Okay. Boris, thank you. I've actually seen speculation to that effect on message boards, in the last couple of weeks. There's also speculation now that that Biden might pick Susan Rice, which is interesting. Anyhow, we'll be right back. Our 1 hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3 hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. So it turns out back in November, the spy agencies in the United States were notifying the Trump administration that something's going on in China. Looks like another SARS outbreak. Maybe we should get ready for this. It was ignored. I've got a new video up over at thomhartmann.com for the supporters of our program that basically goes through the whole timeline, all the way from, actually going back to 2018 when Trump disbanded 3 different anti-pandemic agencies in the Department of Homeland Security, the National Security Council, and the executive branch. Just closed them down, fired the people. That was the end of that. How he ignored the intelligence in November, he ignored the intelligence in December, he ignored the epidemic now coming into the United States in January, he ignored it in February, just going the blow-by-blow timeline. And I think it's really worth having it all in one place, a good recap, a good summary of this that you can refer to and you can share with your friends. It's all over at thomhartmann.com. You can check it out. So we've been talking in the last hour and a half or hour and 20 minutes or thereabouts about, how's this going to play out? Is it going to be inflationary, deflationary? Is it going to end up that we're sacrificing 1 million people in America, but hey, they're disposable. We've got our economy back. Isn't that wonderful? I mean, these are serious life and death issues that this country is confronting at a time that we have a president who frankly doesn't care about the life and death of anybody except him and his immediate family. And for me, it's producing, and I really got in touch with this yesterday, it's producing something close to rage. And yesterday I had an experience and I suddenly realized how road rage happens, particularly in this era. I mentioned a couple days ago, Louise said to me, she drove out to this garden supply center and got some potting soil and stuff. No contact, they bring it out to your car, stick it in the trunk, everything's good. But in any case, she said that she had two times drivers cut her off in traffic and just drove like absolute maniacs, and were like being aggressive toward her. And she's just driving maybe 5 or 10 miles over the speed limit. The cops are out in force looking for speeders right now. So you either drive at the speed limit or you drive crazy, and it's kind of all or nothing. But yesterday we live on a little channel off the Columbia River. In our backyard is that water. And there's a bunch of geese. There are 3 goose families and 1 duck family that have been not quite nesting, but they've been hanging out on the beach behind our house, and which you can see from our back porch, and hanging out on that beach with their babies. One of them has 6 or 7 goslings, or 4 or 5 goslings. One has 2 or 3. The duck has 1 baby. Started out with a bunch, but they're down to the hawks get them, right? And, they feel safe there. And there's food and there's all this kind of stuff. And so yesterday, some guy comes down the beach with his dog and just lets the dog run down and scatter the geese and the babies. And they're all freaking out, and they're jumping in the water, and then the dog chases them in the water. And the duck baby got separated from the duck, and so he's running around inside the channel going cheep, 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 and the mama duck has fled the duck and the dog's in the middle, and Louise is yelling at the dog owner, there's a leash law here, put your dog on a leash, and he yells back, there's thousands of geese, what does it matter if one of them dies? And several of our neighbors who live on the water came out and started yelling at the guy with the dog, and he was yelling back at them. And I was just so furious. I was thinking, I wanted to find something and throw it at this guy. And I thought, oh my God, God forbid if I had a gun. I mean, I don't think I'd shoot him, but I'd probably be shooting in the air to try to, sound like tough guy or something. I mean, it's just... And afterwards, as the adrenaline drained out of me, and I was just watching, Louise was handling it very well. I mean, she was confronting the guy and she was calling him out, but she wasn't doing it with obscenities like I would have. I mean, I was just, all these words are going through my head. And after it was all done, I realized, I haven't felt that kind of rage in in years. And the thing that causes most people to feel rage is powerlessness. It's like, I couldn't stop the dog. I wanted to protect the geese. I mean, every morning we go out and look at them, and it's like they're like our pets. And it just hit me, that people feel rage when they feel like they've lost control. And how must it feel if you've lost your job because of something you didn't do? How must it feel if your wages have crashed? How must it feel if you can't pay your mortgage? I'm very fortunate. I'm on Social Security. I got a $3,000 a month income from the federal government, no matter what. And we pretty much own everything that we have, and so we're okay. We're not rich or anything like that, but we're doing fine. And so, but there's probably a third of America is totally freaked out right now. They're feeling as powerless about their economics as I was about the damn geese. And so it shouldn't surprise us when we have road rage and when we have, explosions in self-destructive behavior like alcoholism and suicide. This is rage internalized. And I think that, some of us also are watching the whole Trump show and feeling powerless about that. I watch the news media making incredibly stupid mistakes in covering what's actually going on or failing to cover what's actually going on. And I'm sitting here yelling at my television. Now, it's not the level of rage that I felt yesterday about the guy with the geese, but I'm pretty pissed off about it. And it's starting to infiltrate our lives. I'm trying to figure out how best to deal with this. I mean, I'm back to meditating regularly, a little more aggressively. I've radically cut back. I mean, we're not going to have a glass of wine tonight, with dinner. We just, we're radically cutting back on alcohol. Trying to get a lot more sleep. Trying to be really nice to each other, Louise and I, and to our family and friends. But I think America is facing essentially a mental health crisis right now, as well as a physical health crisis, a coronavirus, and an economic crisis. We're getting it all thrown at us all at once. What do you think? We'll be back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
In just a moment. It's coming up on 28 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program.
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is called Let the People Pick the President, The Case for Abolishing the Electoral College by Jesse Wegman. And I'm reading from the introduction. This is page 20. But what exactly can we do about the Electoral College? People have been trying to answer that question for more than 2 centuries. Since the first proposed amendment to the Electoral College was introduced in Congress in 1797, there have been more than 700 attempts to reform or abolish it. more by far than any other provision of the Constitution. Only one has succeeded, the 12th Amendment, which was ratified in 1804 to fix a technical flaw in the college's design, but left it otherwise intact. In the late 1960s, an amendment abolishing the college and replacing it with a national popular vote passed the House of Representatives and came extraordinarily close in the Senate, but was blocked by a filibuster. At the time, 80% of the American public supported switching to the popular vote, as did President Richard Nixon and other top Republicans and Democrats. To some, this litany of failures speaks to itself. I think it's a waste of time to talk about changing the Electoral College, former President Jimmy Carter said in 2000. Carter had supported a national popular vote in the 60s and the 70s. I would predict that 200 years from now, we'll still have the Electoral College, he said. Was President Carter right? Is it simply our fate as Americans to remain trapped by the historical quirks of a Constitution that is too easy to revere and too hard to change? Especially after the failed effort in the 60s, when American politics were far less polarized to today, and there was no simple partisan divide over the issue. It's clear that a constitutional amendment is not in the cards. But there may be another way. It's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, an agreement among states to award all of their electors to the winner of the national popular vote, rather than the winner of their statewide vote. The compact will take effect when it is joined by states representing a majority of electoral votes, 270, thus guaranteeing that the candidate who wins the most votes in the country becomes president. The ingenuity of the compact is that it doesn't touch the Constitution. Its target is the statewide winner-take-all rule, currently in use in 48 states. Maine and Nebraska are the exceptions. This rule is what makes presidents out of popular vote losers. It incentivizes presidential campaigns to ignore more than 100 million American voters living in non-competitive states, turning what should be a national electoral contest into a series of bitter, hyper-local brawls. It focuses nearly all campaign spending and policy proposals on a few so-called battleground states, where even a small shift in voting can lead to an electoral jackpot for one side or another. That familiar red and blue map we all obsess over every 4 years, it's nothing but a visual representation of state winner-take-all rules, with each state stamped Democratic or Republican, as though that is its true identity, regardless of how many voters from the other party cast a ballot there. This is bad for democracy, and it should concern all Americans, no matter where they live or which political party they support. In contrast, when candidates know that all votes are equal, and they need a majority of them to win, they're forced to seek the support of all Americans and craft policies that appeal to as many people as possible. The Popular Vote Compact was launched in 2006 and got its first member state, Maryland, the following year. As of October 2019, 15 states in the District of Columbia, together representing 196 electoral votes, had joined. 74 more, and the compact takes effect. So far, only Democratic majority states have joined the compact. And while the 2016 election dealt a significant setback to efforts to enlist Republican-led states, lawmakers of both parties around the country continue to support it, and Republican-led chambers have passed it in 4 states. Critics of the compact call it an end run around the Constitution. And it's true that the Constitution's framers never mentioned something like a popular vote compact. They also never mentioned the winner-take-all rule, but that didn't stop the majority of states from rapidly adopting it to benefit themselves. That's the whole point of the compact. The framers gave states near total control over how to allocate their electors. The fact that the compact is an agreement among states also means that, unlike a constitutional amendment, which is effectively permanent, member states may back out if they later decide they don't want to be a part of it. Opponents of the popular vote argue that no matter how you might achieve it, it's not the way our country is built. As the popular saying goes, we're a republic, not a democracy. The Electoral College is one of the core Republican elements of the framers' constitutional design, like the Senate and the Supreme Court, which are there precisely to prevent majorities from running rampant. In other words, majority rule is not our only organizing principle, and perhaps not even our most important. There are 2 problems, however, with this argument. The minor one is on the surface and involves terminology. The United States is both a republic and a representative democracy. The 2 terms describe the same thing: a government in which the people hold the ultimate power but elect representatives to make laws, policies, and other decisions on their behalf. The founders used the term republic to distinguish what they were building from a monarchy. For them, democracy generally referred to the direct variety, as in ancient Athens or the New England town meeting, where the people literally make the laws themselves. But American politics at the national level has never been and never will be a direct democracy. So any distinction between the terms today is meaningless. As one political columnist put it, to say that the U.S. is a republic and not a democracy is like claiming to eat beef and pork, but not cows and pigs. The bigger problem with the saying is the implication that lies beneath it. The book, Let the People Pick the President, by Jesse Wegman.
Coming up on the Science Revolution, it's amazing. Cleaner air during the pandemic is proving the benefits of a decarbonized economy. Dr. Jay Familietti is here on how the number of people harmed by floods will double worldwide by 2030. In Geeky Science, don't miss the 7 things that happen when you stop eating meat or eat less meat during this pandemic. And our fact of the week is about plummeting wildlife and extinctions. Check out the Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available. So just to prove how these guys think, and I just lay it out, and then I'm going to pick up your phone calls. Ian Millhiser, who used to be a regular on our program back when he was with the Center for American Progress's Think Progress blog, tweets, Wisconsin's Republican Chief Justice, this is the Wisconsin Supreme Court, just dismissed a coronavirus flare-up in Wisconsin. It was in a meat packing plant. Because, quote, it only impacted regular people who work in meat packing. It only impacted people who work in meat packing plants and not, quote, the regular folks, end quote. In other words, it only hit Hispanic people, black people, and poor white people because that's who works in the meat packing plants. Are you getting this? I mean, they're just telling us. There's no mystery. There's no telegraphing. There's no, hidden code. You don't need a decoder ring to figure it out. It's not hitting regular folks. Who's regular folks? Well, ask any Republican over the last 40 years. Regular folks are white men. And maybe white women, depending on what the issue is. As long as it's not affecting, white men, hey, we're good with it. By the way, they busted the guy in Michigan who was wiping his nose on the person in the store. They nailed him. Somebody over on Twitter just pointed that out to me. You can check out my Twitter feed and see it. Robin in Boulder, Colorado. Hey, Robin, what's on your mind?
Well, I totally sympathize with your level of frustration with people. I'm starting to lose it too. Twice now I've seen patriot gatherings, believe it or not, in the People's Republic of Boulder. Very stunning, waving gatherings of people, waving gigantic American flags, not socially distancing, shaking hands around a keg of beer and what have you, bringing their children, no masks. I saw my first one when I was driving home from work the other day. And then the most recent one I saw was right smack in the middle of Boulder Central, right across the street from a natural grocery store, kitty corner to that. And I'm going, whoa, what is going on here? Again, no masks. And so I thought, you know what? If you can't convince conspiracy theorists with facts about wearing a mask and preventing disease spread, I would suggest appealing to their lowest common denominator, which is their paranoia about the deep state, and remind them that masks trip up facial recognition software. There you go.
I love it. It's harder for the cops to know who you are if you're wearing a mask.
They're not, because at a lot of these white supremacist rallies that I've seen in the past on the news, many of them are wearing masks because they don't want to be identified. So they should be wearing masks right now, don't you think?
I mean, your earlier point was that, or assertion was that they're not paying attention to the statistics and what's actually going on. And I would say that actually they're paying very careful attention to the statistics. I've pointed out on this show a number of times, and I on my to-do list, something that I keep forgetting or not getting to every day because I'm swamped right now. But is going back through the news feeds of, pick a media like the New York Times, for example, or CNN. Just go back through the news feed and find the day when that report, that study, and it was maybe a month ago, was first released that said that this disease is disproportionately killing black people. And I believe it was right after the Wisconsin election this came out, but it said that this is disproportionately killing black people. 70% of the people who are dying are black, and only 14, 15, 17% of the population are black, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. Part of it is that black people are overrepresented in the service industry. They're more likely to be bus drivers and, working in McDonald's and whatnot. Another part of it is that, historic discrimination produces poor health in any community that's historically discriminated against, whether it's poor black people or Appalachian whites. But in any case, I think that they're listening to Fox News and right-wing hate radio, which is basically saying this is killing old people who are near death anyway. And by the way, that's largely true. I mean, within a few years of death, they're in nursing homes. That's why they're in nursing homes, number one. And number two, it's disproportionately killing people of color, black people and Hispanic people. And in the meatpacking plants, it's overwhelmingly Hispanic people. So, hey, who cares? It's not killing middle-aged white guys. Well, it is actually, but in very small numbers, fractions of a percent. And so these people figure that, it's fine if they get sick. It'll be like a terrible case of the flu. They'll come out on the other side and they'll be immune for the rest of their lives and they'll be Superman. They won't have to worry about the kryptonite of the coronavirus. And look at those poor, wimpy Democrats who are hiding out in their houses. That's how they're thinking. That's what they're telling each other. And it's actually grounded in some epidemiological truth. And that's the scary part about it, because what they're saying is they're willing to kill off poor people, people of color, poor white people, people of color, and their own elderly relatives in exchange for being able to get a haircut or, get back to work. Getting back to work might be the bigger one, Robin. So,
but that's just the first wave. That's just the first wave, Tom. Who knows what the
Well, that was my point. That was my point before, is when we get the second wave in the fall, and I think it's going to start happening in late summer, given the time ratios here. When we get that second wave, it's going to hit the red states disproportionately because they're not social distancing and they're not protecting themselves. And when it does, you're going to go from 1/10 or even 1% of the population knowing someone who died to 3, 4, 5, 6% of the population knowing someone who died. And there's going to be a tipping point in there somewhere. And when that tipping point is hit, people are going to turn against the Trump and the Republicans. And the question is whether that's going to happen before the election or after the election.
Yeah.
But it's coming. It's coming.
Yeah.
Robin, I got to move along. Thank you so much for the call. Great stuff. Joanne in Baltimore. Hey, Joanne, what's up? Hi, Joanne. What's on your mind?
Hi. I was just wanted to bring up a point. I think at this time, all these states are opening up, that maybe we should just stay home anyway.
Yes.
And not go back to work. Just do a national strike per se. And this would be a great time to organize people too.
Well, here's the problem, Joanne. The reason why these red state governors are declaring an end to the lockdown is because now, if you live in one of the states that's repealed this and you don't want to go to work, you may not claim unemployment benefits. And if you're already on unemployment benefits, you are going to lose those benefits. That's why Brian Kemp is doing what he's doing, or a large part of it. It's why Ron DeSantis is doing what he's doing. It's why Greg Abbott is doing what he's doing. These Republican governors are, quote, opening their states. People aren't necessarily coming back to work, but they're losing their unemployment benefits.
I know, and this is basically a choice between your life or working and earning money. So,
Exactly.
Me, I would choose my life, but I hope everyone else makes that choice too, and just stays put.
Yeah, so, I'm absolutely with you, Joanne. Thank you for the call. Great to hear from you, John in Hammond, Indiana. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. This reminds me of the Turner Diaries. Timothy McVeigh. This anti-government, the irony is they're waving the flag, but, like you and your wife experienced, I see that every day. The fact is the local police don't even enforce a lot of the laws around here. It's like there's this anti-government, or we don't believe in the law, we don't want the law, we don't want people telling us what to do. It's like an anarchist perspective of.
It's not anarchist. It is fascist. It is corporatist.
Yes.
It has been promoted since 1981. Ronald Reagan kicked this off in his inaugural address on January 20th, 1981, when he said, "Government is not the solution to your problems. Government is the cause of your problems." He said it a little more eloquently than that, but that's what he said. And that has been and by the way, that was the mantra of David Koch in 1980 when he ran for vice president of the United States on the Libertarian ticket, saying we need to end public schools, we need to end Social Security and Medicare, we need to end unemployment insurance, we need to end publicly funded roads and highways, we need to end the post office. I mean, that was his platform. And you can easily find it. David Koch's Libertarian 1980 platform. And this is the end point for them. The billionaires own everything. Social Security goes to Bank of America. The Medicare goes to United Healthcare. No more Medicare, no more Social Security. The public roads go to companies that are going to put up toll booths, and they're going to charge you for everything you do. The public roads will be owned by United Airlines or something. This is their vision for this country. This so-called libertarian paradise. It's what Ayn Rand laid out in Atlas Shrugged. It is, it's what Milton Friedman was promoting out of the Chicago School of Economics for decades. It's, to a large extent, it's what has happened in some countries that have adopted his policies. Chile back in the 70s with Augusto Pinochet. To a certain extent, Russia right now under Putin. Again, they liberalized their economy, in quotes, and opened everything up. And what do? You get an autocratic plutocracy, essentially. You get all these billionaires that emerge, and they end up running the show. So, John, your point is well taken. I would just take it a step farther. It's 45 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with more of your calls and the news of the day in just a moment. It's the Thom Hartmann Program, the place where despair is not an option, and we process our rage quickly. Oh, my. We'll be back. Stick around. 45 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Back with your calls in just a moment. Stick around. And welcome back. Johnny in Galveston, Texas. Hey, Johnny, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, I'm all with Robin's suggestion. That's really great thinking. That's good. Anyway, your conversation with her and the other two callers following her dovetailed back to your original question about when will Americans wake up?
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, a significant number of Americans do awaken, quote unquote, and activate on a regular basis somewhat, at least once every generation, if not more often than that. The most recent examples that come to mind is the Coalition Occupy movement in 2011, the Keystone XL activism, the various environmental movements with Greenpeace in the 70s when I was a teenager, up to the current youth activists aligned with Greta Thunberg. The problem is, it's not whether people are waking up or not. The problem is the power elite, the oligarchic class, who use their law enforcement to show up and put people to sleep, metaphorically. They show up and arrest people, tase people, tear up their tents, throw their...
And the media that fails to cover these things.
Say again?
And the media that fails to cover these things.
Absolutely. The media is a conspiratorial. They're part of the problem. They don't give a full depth, contextual analysis of what's going on. They criticize the Occupy. They belittle the Occupy movement when their possessions were being thrown in dumpsters and stuff. And right now, with Greta Thunberg being taken out more or less by this having to social distance, do you think this is all coincidental? Nope.
Yeah.
That's a problem. People do wake up, Tom. The problem is, do enough people wake up at the same time? And can media...
Well, that was my point about the critical mass.
Yes, a critical mass. That's exactly it. So I don't know how we're going to do that with media outside of supporting your program and Pacifica Radio, which I know you do through your donation of your program, which is admirable. Right. I don't know what else. I don't know how else we're going to do this.
Yeah. I think that because the right-wing guys don't, by and large correctly, don't think that there's that much risk to them with the coronavirus. They're out in the streets. The left-wing people are, being more concerned about human life than about the economy, and, more supportive of democracy in the United States than autocracy. And so they're less likely to go out in the streets and more likely to participate in online forums and things. So we're getting a kind of bifurcation, a distorted view of what's real and what's happening on the streets. And
exactly.
I don't know how to activate people on the left to show up in public where the cameras can catch them, because you'd have to social distance. But even with social distancing, there's a risk, right? I mean, somebody sneezes in their mask and you're 5 feet away, you're going to get it. And so.
And then if you show up in your vehicle, they'll figure out a way to arrest people for clogging the traffic, even though there's not much traffic right now.
Yeah, so what may be the good news is that even though we're less visible, we are going to show up in November and take them down in the election. I mean, that may be the case. I certainly hope it's the case. Johnny, I got to run, but thank you for the call. Always nice to hear from you there in Galveston, Texas. Louise and I were down there just a few months ago in Galveston. Won't be going back for a while. Not getting on an airplane. Frontier Airlines now, they're charging you if you want an empty seat, if you want the middle seat next to you to be empty. They're going to charge you extra for your ticket. Expect to see this everywhere. Did you know that Ronald Reagan committed treason to become president in 1980, and George Herbert Walker Bush was in on it, and he avoided being prosecuted for this in 1992 with a little help from Bill Barr? It's on page 116 of my book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. 10 minutes before the hour. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Paul in Woodinville, Washington. Hey, Paul, what's up?
Tom, I don't mean to laugh, but when I hear people say the second wave, the first wave ain't over.
Yeah,
the tsunami ain't over.
It's picking up in the red states right now. It's going down in the blue states, and everybody watches Cuomo saying, hey, we've nailed this, and they think it's the whole country, which is kind of a downside of having Cuomo on TV every day. No,
we are. I think in some ways losing the rhetorical battle with Trump and the economy. People want, and I'm not saying we are. Well, we are in the sense that the consensus of knuckleheads is to just, who cares? Let me give you some easy numbers. I just did this, and I'm sure my math is right because it matches up with reports. So I took 15 cases. We got 15 cases February the 26th. Going to be down to 0. So that's my benchmark. I'm sure we had more than 15 cases, but we had 15 confirmed cases. So in 60 days, we went to 1 million, roughly 60 days. So I thought, what is the rate of increase here? Okay, so I did a little math, a little logarithmic math, and found out that the rate of increase per day is 20%, so 1.2. 1.2, and if you keep raise that to the 60th power and multiply by 15, you'll get 1 million. Well, what does that mean? So I thought, okay, and the reason I know that's right is because the reports are always that cases are doubling every 4 days. So 1.2 to the 4th power is 2. So I got that math is right. Now listen, I decided, okay, we got 1 million cases. Let's just say 1/10 of 1% of that million are running around still infectious. We're starting the game. And remember, the 15 to 1 million was when we were sheltering in place. So and
keep in mind, Paul, the one thing you got to throw in here in all this math is that it looks like 30 to 40% of all cases are free of symptoms, but for several weeks they're shedding virus. So those people are not getting tested, and so they are not included in your million, because the only people pretty much getting tested in the United States, with a few rare exceptions, are people who are actively sick.
Right. Well, I'm kind of taking the same tact as the University of Washington numbers, where they were playing it safe and presuming that people were sheltering in place. Now they're using another presumption that we're actually going to have tests and be able to do contact tracking I'm not doing that. I'm just taking the same thing all over again. I'm just taking the same conditions all over.
So where
I'm
are you
making
going
the
with
best case. Best case scenario. I say take 1,000 people. Say 1,000 people out of 1 million are still infectious, and do the same formula all over again. That's 1,000 times 1.2 to the 60th power, and you come out with 66 million people infected in the next 60 days. And if you had the same death rate, which on the first million was 63,000, that's a 6.3% death rate. The same death rate applied over the next 60 days is 3.5 to 4 million. If you just did to take the brakes off it, these people are just going to go out there already doing it. I mean, these knuckleheads in Michigan, these people don't get it. They don't even know what a virus is. I'm not going to tell you something else. None of those people have a job. There's nothing essential about any of them. If they have time to take
here's the one caveat. Let me toss a caveat into your math here, Paul. Greg Abbott opened the malls this weekend. I don't recall which site it was on that I saw it, but I think it might have been a Raw Story. In one of the biggest malls in Austin, Texas, there were 12 people. Only a third of the stores even bothered to open, and they talked to one of the more high volume stores, and they didn't sell a single thing all day. So even where it's opened back up, people are still social distancing and sheltering in place. And that's going to slow down those numbers that you just laid out. I think it's going to slow it down by at least an order of magnitude.
Well,
you may say by 50%.
Okay, well, an order of magnitude of 66 million would be 6.6 million.
No, which is going to take you to 600,000 dead, or what? You're doing your math. 6 times 6, 3.6 million. That would be 360,000 dead. If you drop it.
No, I came up with 66 million. I mean, let's not get too into the weeds on the math. The fact of the matter is, if we started with 15 cases and ended up with 1 million, all I said was, if you just take 1,000, that's 0.1%, 1,000 of those million that are still infectious and out there, then you end up with 60 times the catastrophe. I mean, we're going to have upwards in the range of 60 million. And here's the thing. I think what people don't understand is, if we have, and now in just a week, it went from 1 million to 1.2 million. I'm like, wait, the 0.2, ladies and gentlemen, is 200,000. That's the 0.2 on 1 million. So the thing is that if we take that
0.2 of 1 million, wait a minute, 2% of 1 million is 200,000.
1.2
0.2% of 1 million is 20,000. No, it's 20,000.
No, 1.2 million.
Oh, you're talking about the transmission rate. You're talking about RT, the R number over time?
I'm talking about that we went from 1 million last week to the number I heard, 1 million infections last week is now 1.2 million.
Right.
Right. So that's 200,000. That's 200,000 in just a week that they say they've tested, and the breaks are just. I don't see this. I just can't see this. And here's the thing: even if we have 5 million people infected and they're unaccounted for, the country is 330 million people. That leaves 325 victims.
No, I get it, Paul.
Paul,
we're about to hit the break. Here's another question. So you're saying 60 days out from now, we'll have 66 million infections. And probably a month after that, more than 2/3 of America has had the infection. At that point, you're looking at August. We now have herd immunity, and Trump opens the economy back up in September. Maybe that's his plan.
We don't know if immunity exists at this time. We don't know about that herd immunity theory.
You're right. Yeah. Although it seems to be playing out in China. It actually does seem to be playing out. But yeah, you're a good point. Paul, thank you for the call. We'll be right back. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
So every week we do a special video for supporters of our program. It's available over at thomhartmann.com. And, it's a private video. And this week I'm talking about the relationship between Donald Trump and Fox News. Trump's recent liberate these states with Democratic governors tweets, which seem to be actually calling for like armed revolt or asking, his crazy followers to let's send some pipe bombs or something like one already has to Democrats. He did that 2 minutes after watching a Fox News segment basically saying the same thing. Fox News is programming the brain of the president, and their programming was, basically developed by Roger Ailes to infuriate people. This outrage as a way of holding people so that they can sell advertising. And it's doing harm to our republic. You can check the whole thing out, the whole new video, over at thomhartmann.com.
This is our book today is Playing with Fire, the 1968 election and the transformation of American politics by Lawrence O'Donnell. The first chapter, Seizing the Moment. It starts in 1968. Richard Nixon was in a makeup chair when he met Roger Ailes. Maybe it was the makeup chair that set Ailes off. He was looking at the man who might have been president right now if he had just sat in the makeup chair CBS offered him in Chicago before the first televised presidential debate in American history. Nixon had ignored the network's makeup artist and used a drugstore product called Lazy Shave to cover his heavy 5 o'clock shadow. Nixon once said, "I can shave within 30 seconds before I go on television and still have a beard." The day after the debate, the Chicago Daily News ran the headline, "Was Nixon sabotaged by TV makeup artists?" Richard Daley, the all-powerful Democratic mayor of Chicago, said, "My God, they've embalmed him even before he died." Nixon lost the election to John F. Kennedy by 0.2% of the vote, 49.7% to 49.5%. In an election that close, every mistake matters. A mistake like not getting the makeup right was the kind of thing that infuriated Roger Ailes. Now, 7 years later, Ailes was meeting Nixon for the first time in the makeup room of the Mike Douglas show. At age 26, Ailes looked like an assistant, but he was the boss, the executive producer of the show. And Nixon was once again a presidential candidate in what was beginning to look like a crowded field covering the 1968 Republican nomination. Ailes wanted Nixon to be president, and he knew the most powerful force blocking Nixon's path to the White House was television. To win the White House in the 1960s, you had to understand and respect the power of television. Ailes also knew that one of Nixon's potential rivals for the Republican nomination understood everything about television, Ronald Reagan, the former film and TV actor. Ailes wondered what Nixon had learned about TV since the makeup disaster of the 1960 campaign. Sitting in the makeup chair, Nixon offhandedly mentioned to Ailes how silly it felt to try to reach voters by appearing on an afternoon talk show like this one instead of a news show like Meet the Press. The Mike Douglas show is targeted at housewives and usually populated by B-list showbiz celebrities. In response, Ailes instantly rattled off a list of every bad move Nixon had ever made on TV, and it was a long list. Ailes was a teenager when he'd seen some of these things. This was not the way people talked to former Vice President Richard Milhous Nixon. There was none of the deference Nixon had become accustomed to over the decades, and Nixon loved it. Nixon made Ailes an offer he couldn't refuse. Instead of trying to make Mike Douglas America's biggest afternoon TV star, make Richard Nixon America's next president. With Ailes on the media team, the Nixon campaign was ready to make the move from being the worst TV campaign to the best. "We're going to build this whole campaign around television," Nixon told his media team. "You boys just tell me what to do and I'll do it." Roger Ailes' career in Republican politics, which included every day he ran Fox News, turned out to be longer than Richard Nixon's. Ailes became more influential in Republican politics than Nixon ever was. We have reason to wonder who would be president today if Richard Nixon had not provoked Roger Ailes in the Mike Douglas show makeup room. Such are the seeds that were planted in American politics in the 1968 presidential campaign. Run, Bobby, Run is the subhead for the next part of this. Bobby was a natural on television. In 1967, he was the only potential presidential candidate who could charm a TV audience just by being himself. All he needed was his smile. Bobby was the Elvis of American politics, the only politician who didn't need a last name to identify him. But his last name was everything. It was Bobby Kennedy's last name that made every potential candidate fear him. As the field of candidates began to take shape in 1967, every campaign calculation depended on Bobby, even when he showed no signs of wanting to run, even when he told people he wasn't going to run. President Lyndon Baines Johnson feared Bobby to the point of obsession. Johnson thought Bobby was the only one who could do the unthinkable, challenge the incumbent president's grip on the Democratic nomination. Johnson was sure that Bobby was the only Democrat who might dare run against him. He was wrong. Nixon feared Bobby too, as did every Republican planning a campaign. Nixon knew exactly what to fear. He had lost to a Kennedy before. Losing to a Kennedy meant losing to the Kennedy political machine, and it meant losing it to the Kennedy style. A political machine can be beaten by a better political machine, though Nixon had never seen a better political machine than the Kennedys. Kennedy's style was something else. Nixon knew there was nothing Ailes could do for his image that could compete with Kennedy's style. Nixon couldn't change his sharply receding hairline. At 54, he was too old to do anything but tamp down his short, dark hair as flat as possible on his head. Bobby's hair had grown longer every year of the 1960s. Now at 42, he had the shaggiest hair in the United States Senate. His little brother Ted was the only other senator with a full head of hair. Bobby's hair was beginning to grow over his ears, rock musician length for the Senate then. And everywhere Bobby spoke outside the Senate chamber, he was treated like a rock star. That's what Nixon and Johnson feared most about Bobby, the way the crowds responded to him. They'd never seen anything like it in politics. Nixon and Johnson were both old enough to remember the first time anyone saw fans screaming and swooning for Frank Sinatra in the 1940s, before, during, and after every song Sinatra sang. America saw an even more intense version of that fan reaction when the Beatles landed in the United States in 1964. And now Nixon and Johnson saw a version of it happening to Bobby. Everywhere Bobby went, crowds worked themselves into frenzies. When he spoke, he didn't sound like any senator they'd heard before. His voice wasn't stiff and self-conscious. The book Playing with Fire by Lawrence O'Donnell.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And Kevin Camps is on the line with us. He's the regulatory waste specialist at beyondnuclear.org. I can't even remember how George W. Bush used to mispronounce that, but nuclear, I can't even say it. Anyhow, nuclear, okay, Sean tells me. Beyond Nuclear is the Twitter handle as well. And Kevin, welcome back to the program. Thank you for dropping by today. There's a whole bunch of new news that has to do with our ticking time bomb of a nuclear power generation system across the country. Where would you like to start?
Yeah, the pronunciation, nuclear, kind of like peculiar to my ear. So.
Yeah.
Oh, there is so much going on. I'm in Michigan during the pandemic with my family, and right here there's breaking news left and right. So for one thing, we just learned from the Toledo Blade yesterday evening that the Fermi Unit 2 refueling outage has been suspended for a prolonged or extended safety stand down, as the company is calling it. And it's directly
Fermi
related
2 is the reactor near Detroit, right?
Yeah, Fermi Unit 1 was the infamous meltdown in 1966. We Almost Lost Detroit, the book by John Fuller, that was then made into a song by Motown, We Almost Lost Detroit. And Fermi Unit 2 has been operating since 1988. It is a Fukushima Daiichi twin design, so we know what it's capable of. And incredibly, the COVID-19 spread at the nuclear plant seems to be so bad that the company has suspended the refueling outage. This is something that rarely to never happens, and it must be bad if they've done so. and it's very telling that the company did this, not the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which really is AWOL. It is derelict in its duty right now. It has washed its hands as a safety regulatory agency of the COVID-19 pandemic, says it's not its department, and OSHA has not stepped in to do anything about it. So it's really out of control.
Yeah. Nate tells me it was Gil Scott Heron who did We Almost Lost Detroit.
Yeah, I couldn't come up with his name. Sorry.
Yeah, there you go. No, it's good. It's and thanks to Nate for that. So my guess is, Kevin, that over the last 20 years, as nuclear power has become less than popular, and working in a nuclear power plant has become something that's weekly ridiculed by Homer Simpson, that probably most of the people coming out of college with engineering degrees are not eager to go to work, or even coming out of high school with a high level of technical competence are not enthusiastic about going to work in a nuclear power plant. And therefore, most of their workforce is probably well over 40, and probably a good chunk of it is north of 50, which means that they are the people who are going to get really, really sick from this virus. And that might account for why the nuclear power plant is shutting down. But companies that have a much younger workforce are not experiencing that kind of, they're not being hit that hard. What do you think? I mean, I'm just speculating.
You're right. Well, no, you're absolutely right. 20 years ago, there were less than 150 graduate students in the United States to fill nuclear engineering ranks. And the industry's pushed back in the last 20 years, gotten federal money to throw at community college students and college students to try to entice them into the industry as nuclear engineers. But it hasn't entirely worked. So what you do have is a very aged workforce, like you said, that is vulnerable. And making matters worse, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has done worse than nothing. What they've done is they've given the industry everything it's asked for in the past several weeks. So, for example, limits on work hours, 12-hour per day limits, 72-hour work week limits, which are already pretty extreme in a high-stress nuclear power plant. They have taken those limits off, and now it's 16 hours per day, up to 86 hours per week. People working that many hours, especially under stress, it's the equivalent of drinking 3 beers on the job in terms of your mental acuity. So mistakes can get made. As you said, people could be more vulnerable to contracting the virus in this weakened physical state. A coalition of nearly 90 groups wrote to the vice president about this, saying something has to be done. That was on Earth Day, and we've yet to hear a response.
And interestingly, there's a 72-hour limit on trucking, truck drivers, and an absolute limit, or maybe it's a similar limit. Maybe I'm wrong on the number, but there are limits on how many hours truck drivers can drive, per day, per week, and until they hit a maximum and all that kind of stuff. The Trump administration has suspended most of those rules too. So expect to see far more trucking accidents. I saw an email you sent. It just arrived a few minutes ago, actually, about leakage at one of these plants.
Yeah, again from Michigan. This time in southwestern Michigan, where I'm at. It's the Cook nuclear power plant. 2 giant reactors, each over 1,000 megawatts electric, and Unit 2 had a primary coolant leak just a few days ago. So it's the first incident of this severity in the country that we know of this year so far, and it just happened in the middle of this pandemic.
What happens to a nuclear power plant if its primary coolant leaks to the point that it's no longer covering the core?
Well, fortunately, the leak rate that I remember reading about was 8 gallons per minute, which is relatively small. But it did violate technical specifications, and they were able to bring the reactor down to 0 power levels. But it's a very serious incident when you're leaking primary coolant water because, worst case scenario, you leak enough of that and you're going to have a meltdown. So fortunately, this time they were able to bring it under control. They are at 0% power. They're still hot, though. You have to cool a reactor for days until it's in cold shutdown. That's what went wrong at Fukushima Daiichi. They couldn't cool the reactors that were still hot, and so they had the meltdown. So fortunately, it seems things are a lot more stable at Cook Unit 2, but it shows that incidents can happen, certainly during a pandemic, which raises all kinds of questions. I mean, how do you evacuate a population when you're supposed to be sheltering in your house? You can't do both. So those are the risks they're running. by operating nuclear power plants at this time.
That's remarkable. And for those people who may not be old enough to remember 3 Mile Island and the infamous movie with what was it, Jane Fonda in that, or whoever it was,
Michael Douglas, Jack Lemmon,
yeah. Who and by the way, if you're sheltering in place and you want a good movie to watch, I don't know if it's on Netflix or Amazon Prime or what, but it's probably out there someplace. What was the title of the movie?
China Syndrome.
The China Syndrome. That's right. It was the China Syndrome. Just give us a quick recap of what happens if somebody working in a nuclear power plant finally just is so exhausted that they fall asleep because they've been working more than 70 hours, and coolant leak happens and it just keeps on leaking.
Yeah, well, if you lose the coolant to the core, you can't cool the hellishly hot core, which is 600 degrees Fahrenheit. And if the temperature keeps going up to something like 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, that's when the cladding on the fuel rods ignites or melts. It's zirconium. And now you have a reactor core meltdown, and you hope that containment holds and that hazardous releases of radioactivity are not emitted into the environment. But at 3 Mile Island, there were emissions. There's various theories as to how that happened. There were hydrogen explosions that took place. And so people were exposed to hazardous radioactivity downwind. The official version is that nobody got hurt. Well, talk to, literally thousands of families who lost people to cancer, for example, afterwards. And that class action lawsuit was run out of time by the courts, unfortunately. So those people were just left to suffer on their own, or they reached settlements with the company, which required non-disclosure. They had to just be quiet about it if they were going to get their money. So, the casualties from a trucking incident due to fatigue are serious, but compared to a nuclear reactor meltdown, add some orders of magnitude.
Yeah. All the information's over at beyondnuclear.org. And Kevin Camps, the radioactive waste specialist. Kevin, thanks for dropping by. It's always great talking with you.
Likewise. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Have a good one. So we'll be back in just a minute with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Is this the end of democracy? Is that the end point that Trump and his billionaire oligarchs are working toward? Stick around. And welcome back. Oh, let's see here. April in... hang on just a second, April. There we go. April in Santa Monica, California. What's on your mind today? Thank you for watching Free Speech TV.
Oh, no, yes, and thank you, Tom, for everything that you do. I called last week because I've been racking my brain trying to figure out what had happened that allowed us to elect Donald Trump as president in the first place. And we all know that if we didn't have the Electoral College, he would not be president. If it were the law of the land that anyone running for president show their taxes, he would not be president. I now realize that it's not a law that you have to have White House briefings because, you can just do that. I'm wondering, what would we have to do? I don't know if it'd have to be an amendment or to make it so that whoever is the president of the United States, whenever they address the citizenry, they are considered under oath. And because this person that we have in the presidency now, I think someone that they've come clean with the fact that he doesn't like to be under oath. He doesn't sue people. He doesn't actually go after anyone because he runs the risk of perjuring himself all the time. What could we do? Because I think that makes sense that the United States president should be considered under oath when they address the people.
That's a great question, April. The question presumes, respectfully, that it's a binary choice. It's all or nothing. Either the president can basically tell as many lies as he wants, or there is some sort of police agency that determines that the president has lied and somehow punishes him or corrects him publicly or whatever that may be. I'd say that there's a third option, and that's called congressional oversight, and that's what the framers of the Constitution had in mind. And that's exactly what Trump has been denying us. And, for example, during his impeachment hearings, not one single document, not one single witness came out of the White House. And this was all about what happened in the White House. I think it would have been much more damning if he had done what Richard Nixon did, for example, or what Bill Clinton did. Bill Clinton turned over 18 cases, as I recall, of hundreds of thousands of documents, maybe millions of documents to Congress, as did Nixon, and ultimately even the White House tapes. So congressional oversight has been crippled by this president, and it has not been restored by the Supreme Court. And that's the mechanism right now, given that we have a Supreme Court that has, exercises judicial review. And that's one of the cases that they're going to be hearing this week, is what happens when Congress subpoenas stuff from the White House, or maybe in this term, maybe over the next couple of weeks. Does Congress actually have the power to force the president to give them things? And if so, how do they exercise that power? Who goes into the White House and grabs the files?
Yeah, well, and that's what's also really confusing to me, because, if you break the law, you break the law. And the rest of us, we can't just ignore subpoenas. And I know they do have a jail there, right? They do. They can take people and put them.
They did have some.
Yeah, they did. Okay.
They did have the old jail in the basement of the Capitol building hasn't been used since the 1830s, and since the 1860s, it's where they keep the hearse that Lincoln was buried in.
Because whatever needs to happen, because we need to have some way of holding him accountable, and we don't.
I agree,
and that's not his fault.
And it's his fault that he's blocking it, but he's also exposing this terrible weakness, which you've narrowed in on, and that's brilliant, April. Thank you very much, and I think that the solution is congressional oversight. We'll be right back. Our 1-hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3-hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. So for our Thom Hartmann Insider videotape that is over, or videotape, YouTube, whatever you want to call it, private video that's available over at thomhartmann.com, I'm talking this week about Donald Trump just completely giving in to Erdogan of Turkey, the president of Turkey, the dictator of Turkey now. And this theory that Jared Kushner okayed the killing, at least the capture, perhaps the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, and to Mohammed bin Salman, and that Erdogan has the tape of it, and that when he called up Donald Trump a couple weeks ago and said, I want you to pull out of Syria and give me those Kurds so I can kill them and take that land, that he did it because Erdogan threatened him. And then Erdogan comes to the United States, a week or two later and gets a whole state dinner thing. Check it all out. It's over at thomhartmann.com. I think you'll find it fascinating. And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Terry in Eugene, Oregon. Hey, Terry, what's up?
Hey, Tom, how you doing? The ideology that profit over people seems to be running everything now. And I'm just curious, it's never always been that way. And it seems now it's more rampant than ever. Again, the idea that a human being or money is more important than a human being. And you see that more, I don't want to say just Republicans, but just that concept, that whole brainwashing aspect of money over people. And that has to change. And it feels like that's not even close to changing right now. And it's frustrating to see it daily.
Right. Let me take you into the Wayback Machine here, Terry. Peter Farb, who wrote Man's Rise to Civilization and the Native American back in the 60s, he's passed away now, but it's just an absolutely brilliant book. It's the first contact stories with 37 different Native American tribes. He pointed out there's this thing called social overhead. There's a whole chapter about this in my book, Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight. And social overhead is how many members of society do you have who have the ability to be productive but are not productive. In other words, you got a certain number of people in society who are making food, who are making housing, who are making clothing, who are making the things that we all need. And in a tribal society, that's pretty much everybody. Pretty much, Native American societies, that's pretty much everybody who's capable of doing it. And then you've got the people who are not productive, And you saw this explosion in these non-productive people happening as we moved out of hunting and gathering into farming. And as agricultural societies, Daniel Quinn writes about this in Ishmael, as agricultural societies spread, the food, particularly in climates where you have seasonality, where there's long seasons like the winter where nothing is being grown, you have people who store the food, who lock the food, and who decide who gets the food, which is the earliest form of money and power. And those people will figure out ways to get more and more of the food and lock it up more and more aggressively and make other people bend to their will. And sometimes they do that by saying that the gods tell them to. And so you get these huge unproductive structures like the Catholic Church, where they're not actually producing anything that helps society or serves people, or any local church for that matter. I mean, you can make an argument that there's some emotional support there, but it's not necessary for existence. This is social overhead. Government, arguably, is social overhead. These people are not producing anything. But the biggest form of social overhead that we now have in the United States, in my opinion, is multi-generational hereditary wealth. These people like the Koch brothers, who inherited, millions and millions of dollars from their father. Donald Trump inherited millions of dollars from his father. And they build these business empires, but they themselves are not doing anything productive. All of the money that they make is because at the very bottom of that pyramid, people are working. The social overhead, for example, Peter Farb points out, in Egypt during the pyramid building time. They were just burning through human beings to build those pyramids. But the social overhead was huge. You had this probably 3/4 of all the wealth in Egypt was controlled by basically a small number of families. They were the pharaohs. And we're now at that point in the United States where we have massive social overhead. So if you ask, where did this start? It really started with the agricultural revolution. The earliest records of it are from 4,000 to 7,000 years ago with the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story in Samaria, what is now known as northern Iraq, which used to be covered with forests, and these tribal people, the Sumerians, settled down along the Euphrates River and built this city. It was called Ur, and Gilgamesh was their leader. And he went up and cut the forests of northern Iraq, which is why it's still desert today, and built this giant city. But he was the ultimate leader. And of course, the gods were upset that he cut the forests, so they punished him by making their barley fields. They had hundreds of thousands of acres growing barley, and they were irrigating it from the river, but they didn't know how to properly do irrigation. So those fields ended up being filled with salt from the river, and the net result of it was that the fields died, the city died, and their story about it was that the gods punished them. But it was another story of cultural overhead. So, that's where the profit over people started, was the people who had locked up the food, and in our case, the people who have locked up the money, which represents access to food. And therefore, you've got literally 40 million people in America who in the last year have experienced food insecurity. You've got 100 million people in the United States who are living at or slightly or below, substantially in many cases, the poverty line. We've got, at the same time, you've got the largest collection of billionaires on the planet controlling just the top 100 billionaires in the United States, controlling enough money to basically make everybody on the bottom, not necessarily wealthy, but certainly, getting along fine. But that's where it started. Did I answer your question, Terry?
Yes, you did. You're amazing. Thank you so much, Tom. Have a great day.
Okay. Thank you, Terry. Good talking to you. And this is like the seminal question of our time. The whole thing of the New Deal, the whole thing of the Great Society, Franklin Roosevelt and Lyndon Johnson, those programs were about reducing cultural overhead, about taking money out of the pockets and the hands of the very, very rich and putting it in the hands of the very, very poor, and putting people back to work and strengthening small businesses. And then Reagan came along and said, no, we're going to increase cultural overhead. We're going to make the rich even richer. We're going to consolidate the number of businesses. My book on monopoly, which is coming out in a few months, talks all about this, about how, get rid of the small businesses, get rid of the entrepreneurs, concentrate everything. That's the Republican way now.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
It's coming up on 28 minutes past the hour. We'll be back with your calls right after this. It's the Thom Hartmann Program, the place where despair is not an option.
Our book today for the Thom Hartmann Book Club is The Age of Eisenhower, America and the World in the 1950s by William I. Hitchcock. This is from chapter 19, page 475, about 3/4 of the way through the book. Republicans of the 1950s knew how to sell a product. They pioneered the use of television advertising in politics, and at their national conventions in 1952 and 1956, they mobilized actors, dancers, acrobats, sports figures, crooners, jugglers, and sword swallowers to infuse their rather dull message of peace and prosperity with some pizzazz. In mid-July 1960, though, as the GOP faithful gathered in Chicago at the International Amphitheater, the same hall in which Ike and Dick had formed their political tandem 8 years earlier, the convention planners were running out of ideas. A giant elephant named Koa, on loan from Louisiana, proved to be too big to amble down the aisles of the hall and had to be returned. The torchlight parade of 500 young Republicans had to be canceled due to the fire hazard of their kerosene-soaked rags. Plans to get Henry Fonda into costume as Abraham Lincoln, a role he had played woodenly in the 1939 film Young Mr. Lincoln, were scotched when Fonda turned out to be a Democrat. Half the hotel rooms in Chicago remained empty a few days before the convention. Besides an absence of hoopla, the top Republican leaders had serious worries. A Gallup poll on the eve of the convention showed that since 1952, the Republicans had lost support among business and professional voters, white-collar workers, and farmers, three key demographic groups. And they had made no inroads among skilled and unskilled laborers who favored the Democratic Party by a ratio of 4-1. President Eisenhower's personal popularity had masked serious weaknesses in the Republican Party. As the Republicans gathered in Chicago, John Kennedy, a junior senator with little international name recognition, led Nixon in the polls by 4 points. And I should add, Nixon was the vice president to Eisenhower. The press corps, bored to tears by the lack of drama in Republican ranks, worked hard to breathe life into the candidacies of New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller and Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, who might, they earnestly hoped, challenge Nixon for the GOP nomination from the left and the right. The Washington Post editorial page noted that both parties inclined toward moderate nominees like Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and Nixon, but cautioned that, quote, an excess of moderation can yield a pudding devoid of flavor or shape, end quote, and hoped that Goldwater would add a dash of, quote, pepper to the otherwise bland old party's Chicago solemnities, end quote. Indeed, old guard supporters of the dear departed Bob Taft now had a new champion in the ruggedly handsome conservative from the Desert West. It was not to be. Goldwater did not seek the nomination and backed Nixon. Rockefeller, whom most veteran Republicans distrusted for his ideological elasticity and his vanity, pressured Nixon to adopt a number of Kennedy-like platform planks on issues such as defense spending, civil rights, health insurance, and housing. Nixon, terrified that a Rockefeller boomlet might snatch away his long-sought prize, caved into these demands before meeting with Rocky in New York on July 22nd, 3 days before the convention opened. Rockefeller, in turn, threw his support to Nixon in a feeble gesture of party unity. In extracting concessions from Nixon on the GOP platform, though, Rockefeller managed to weaken Nixon's case that he and he alone had the toughness to confront Khrushchev on the world stage. The real challenge Nixon faced in taking the leadership of the Republican Party did not come from Goldwater or Rockefeller. It came from Eisenhower. Of course, Ike supported Nixon's presidential bid since Nixon offered the best hope of extending the Eisenhower legacy. But the distance between those two men, which had always been great, never seemed wider than in 1960. Eisenhower had become the world's most respected, most recognized, and most liked man. For all of his apparent political weaknesses and occasional lapses in his mishandling of the U-2 affair, he occupied an unassailable place in the pantheon of great figures of his time. His war service alone would have placed him on history's pedestal, but he followed that with 8 years of dignified leadership of a country whose global power had reached unprecedented dimensions. When Eisenhower arrived in Chicago on July 26 to address the Republican convention, over 1 million Chicagoans lined the streets along his route to the Sheraton Blackstone Hotel. Shouts of joy rang through the miles of well-wishers. "We like Ike" signs dotted the scene, along with hand-painted expressions of thanks to the old warrior. Confetti, so dense that it stuck to Ike's moist and beaming face, poured from the rooftops. Banners and flags draped every storefront, and lampposts in a blaze of red, white, and blue. Seated before him, or behind him in the open-top presidential Lincoln, Illinois Governor William G. Stratton and Senator Everett Dirksen seemed like supernumeraries. It was Ike the crowd wanted. A loudspeaker in a truck following the motorcade blared out a popular tune by the Four Knights, "I Love the Sunshine of Your Smile." The president, visibly moved, told reporters outside the hotel, "It's one of the finest crowds I've ever seen." On Tuesday evening, Senator Dirksen, a famously orotund speaker in a profession known for producing magnificent windbags, came to the podium in the amphitheater to introduce the president. Few recalled that 8 years earlier, Dirksen had nominated Senator Taft. Anyhow, the book is The Age of Eisenhower by Hitchcock. Science, don't miss the 7 things that happen when you stop eating meat or eat less meat during this pandemic. And our fact of the week is about plummeting wildlife and extinctions. Check out The Science Revolution wherever fine podcasts are available. In our latest video for folks who support our show over at thomhartmann.com, it's pretty mind-boggling, actually. The candidate Trump back in 2016 said, "I'm not going to cut Social Security like every other Republican, and I'm not going to cut Medicare or Medicaid. Every other Republican is going to cut, but I won't." That's what he said. Well, what did his budget actually propose? His budget actually proposed, this is last year's budget. Congress didn't pass it, thank God, but this is what his budget proposed. $1.9 trillion in cuts to Medicare and Medicaid, and $26 billion in cuts to Social Security. And now he is block granting Medicaid to the states, which is already cutting back on Medicaid programs in the red states. You can check it all out over at thomhartmann.com. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Fascinating. I just got my newsletter. I was looking at this, checking my mail during the break, and I got my Nature newsletter, and there's this amazing story. They are working out the genetics, and thus, it's like looking in a time machine, right? You look at somebody's genome, and you can see what was happening in their genetics 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, 1,000 years ago. So they're doing this with SARS. And what they're saying is that the year 1200, right, 800 years ago, more or less, or 900 years ago, in the year 1200, the SARS there was only one SARS virus. And that in the year 1200, it split into 2. And one of those 2 became a virus that is known as the SARS-CoV, which is I believe, is the SARS virus that had the outbreak in China and ended up in North America, and we had like 8,000 cases, and we finally stamped it out, which China and Australia and New Zealand are trying to do with this one. So that was 1,200 years ago, and then but the second one that split, it split out, and in 1700. Around the time, of the intense population of New York, of America, it split again. One went into a virus that infects pangolins, and the other went into a virus that infects bats. It's called RATG13. It's the closest known relative of SARS. And then that split out in the late 1900s, around 1970, into 2 separate viruses, the RATG13, the bat virus, and SARS-CoV-2, which is now known as the SARS-CoV-19 or the COVID-19 virus. So this virus goes back all the way to 1200, the year 1200, as far as we can tell. I think that's absolutely fascinating. I'm just a total science geek around this stuff, but I thought that was really good. Kenyatta in Los Angeles. Hey, Kenyatta, what's up?
Oh, I wanted to say hello and thank you for mentioning the epidemic within the pandemic, which is the pre-existing condition of being black in America. And though I appreciate your mentioning the fact that black people in this country have disproportionately been affected by this virus and have died from it, disproportionately, grossly so in some states, this is nothing new. Across the board, if you look at any health metric in this country and almost any disease, black people always come out dead last. So this is just an extension of that, and unfortunately, just another manifestation of what I call blackism in America. And that's unfortunate. But I do want to tell you that there is some good news, I guess, in all of this, and that's, it's kind of morbidly good, but, if you'll notice, there haven't been any mass shootings since the lockdown.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and where are the mass shooters? God forbid. Excellent points, Kenyatta, and I would add that, and I haven't, like I said earlier, I haven't had time to really do the research on this. And if you decide to pick this up and run with it, let me know if there's anything to this, and if you can document it, I will credit you in anything I read about it. And I know you write for opednews.com frequently, and in fact, I've referenced your writing before. But it seems to me, and I'm just doing this from memory, like I said, I haven't done the deep dive into the timelines, but it seems to me that there was this report that came out 3-4 weeks ago, thereabouts, that said, hey, wait a minute, everybody, it looks like this is disproportionately killing black people. And 3 or 4 days after that report, which was widely reported, it was all over MSNBC and CNN, it was all over Fox News, 3 or 4 days after that report came out, that was when these white billionaires started aggressively funding these open the economy movements, and the former Klan members who now call themselves, don't tread on me people, or maggots, or whatever they call themselves, they came out in large numbers at the state capitals demanding that the economy be opened, and all the pressure started because those are all white people, right? And it's not going to affect us, it's mostly black people. And I think that there's an absolute cause-effect relationship there. What do you think?
Absolutely, it's culling the herd. I'm going to tell you a real quick story. When I was 16 years old, I got my driver license, and I was so happy, of course, like any 16-year-old. And like me, I was raised by my dad. I'm single parent, and I went home and I told my dad, I says, I got my driver's license and I'm going to be an organ donor. And in California, for an organ donor, there's a designation on your driver's license saying so. And he looked at me and he said, boy, don't you do that. You go back there and you take that off. Because if they find out you're an organ donor and you get hurt in an accident or something, that's even more incentive for them to let your black ass die. And I never forgot that.
Wow. Kenyatta, you bring some of the most moving moments to this program. Thank you so much for the call.
Sure.
It's good talking with you. Randy in Ottawa, Iowa. Hey, Randy, what's up?
Hey, Tom. I can't believe I came after Kenyatta. I listen to him every time. Whenever I hear him, I like to listen to him. So I wanted to reference, there's several things you've talked about that touched me today that I feel strongly about. But one of them is I've had an undercurrent with me since you wrote the book on the Second Amendment and the gun rights and your feelings on guns. Now, when you look back at what happened to you, was that yesterday with the geese and the duck and
yes, afternoon.
So and you see these guys with their ARs and stuff like that showing up at the Capitol. That there are things going on in this country that you can't put your finger on, that you don't see on the surface, and it's my feeling that at some point us peaceful Democrats or peaceful Americans, Republicans alike, may have to fight fire with fire in order to protect ourselves, and if it ever breaks down to angry mobs. And it's sad, but I was wondering, as you go through this and as this situation develops, I would like to listen to you if your opinion changes as to the necessity
bearing arms.
On bearing arms, and I'm a veteran, and I was trained on a M16 and M202 grenade launcher and the M60A1 machine gun, and I don't own an AR-15 I own a hunting rifle, but at some point when things look really funny, I might, whether I have to use it or not, I might want to have one. So I just wanted to lay that out there, and for you to
you're
think
thinking,
about.
Randy. I think your thinking is widely reflected in America. The guns are flying off the store shelves. A lot of states have listed gun dealerships as essential businesses that have to stay open or can stay open. And I don't think that those are all being bought by right-wing crazies. I may be wrong.
They're not.
I may be very
They
wrong.
are not.
I don't think so.
You can't buy ammunition in most places, right? Like a Shields or a Bass Pro. They're like 30 and 30 days to 60 days out before they can supply their orders, and they might not be able to fulfill them. So
wow.
The
so
thing
is this
that,
the third? I know there was a huge ammunition shortage in 2000 late in December of 2008 and January 2009 after Obama was elected. And then there was another one. In fact, there's a Wikipedia page just for these two ammunition shortages. The second one happened in the weeks after he was reelected. Is this the third one right now?
Sandy Hook was a big one.
There was another ammunition shortage after Sandy Hook. Fascinating. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you,
Randy,
Tom.
thank you. You're welcome. Good talking with you. It's 45 minutes past the hour. I'm not going to take any kind of position on that, advocate it one way or another. I understand self-defense, but I also don't think that guns are good things to have in your home.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And the main reason for that is people are far more likely to use a gun for suicide or have an accidental death than they are to use a gun to deter an invader or something like that. And welcome back. Let's see here. Joan in Greenville, North Carolina. Hey, Joan, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. I wanted to speak to your premise about the cult followers or Trumpism followers doing an about face when the tables start to turn on their own people dying. I thought the same since Trump was installed, but recently I watched a documentary about Jim Jones, and it completely changed my mind, completely turned my head around. What I hadn't taken into account were the more zealous among them, because, they're not monolithic. They vary in their zealotry, towards their cult leader. And that the more zealous among them will become enforcers. I mean, members of his cult actually killed a number of people who dissented and didn't want to,
right.
Go,
and one member of the cult
that
sent
suicide
bombs to all of the Democratic leadership. And if he had been a slightly more competent bomb maker, he almost certainly would have killed a number of, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, President Obama. A bunch of folks like that. And, he had
well, that just completely changed my head around.
Yeah.
My concern is the enforcer mentality might kick in, I mean, they're getting more and more brazen because they're not being challenged. So, why wouldn't they? Like Trump, you don't challenge me, I have a green light to go forward and become more escalate.
So in your metaphor, is going out in public without social distancing the equivalent of drinking Kool-Aid for, the people who were following Jim Jones? Yes, I will take a risk on my life.
I don't think they see it as that. I don't think they see it as that. My point was not necessarily a suicide pact, but that they're following, and they're not, they're following the cult. Their cult is their religion, and they're not thinking critically. Obviously, they aren't. They wouldn't be following Trump as they were. But my point is that, the more zealot among them are going to become enforcers, and
it appears that I have
line.
one of them on hold here, Doug in Springfield, and I'll pick up his call in about a minute and a half when we rejoin our commercial stations. Joan, thanks. Appreciate the call. Ken in New Bedford, Mass. Hey, Ken, you got a quick one here?
Yes, very quick. Today is the 202nd birthday of Karl Marx, and about 150 years ago, he wrote something that very much pertains to what's going on in the world. He wrote that in a monarchy, the bourgeoisie rules by force, whereas in a republic, the bourgeoisie rules by deception. So I thought you'd enjoy
and
that.
That deception is cloaked in the robes of economic dominance? Is that the point?
Well, deception, meaning lies, which we know that Donald does more than any other president that we've ever had, I suppose. And and that's how they get by. The whole thing is a house of cards built of lies.
Yeah. Well, the question, I guess, then is, thank you, Ken. I guess the question then, given, what you're saying, and I don't disagree with it, is, when do they start to wake up? And I'm thinking that it's going to start happening when people in their own families start dying. Fewer than 1% of Americans, probably somewhere between 1 and 2% of Americans, know somebody who has died from this disease. But in high density, the Northeast, it's probably more like 5%, which means in Nebraska, it's probably 1/100th of 1%. So, when do they wake up? We'll be back. Did you know that Ronald Reagan committed treason to become president in 1980 and George Herbert Walker Bush was in on it and he avoided being prosecuted for this in 1992 with a little help from Bill Barr? It's on page 116 of my book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. Welcome back. It's 10 minutes before the hour. Doug in Springfield, Illinois. Hey, Doug, what's up? It says here you're a Trump supporter.
How are you? I am a Trump supporter, and I am offended by you and your callers that think everybody that's a Trump supporter is a Nazi right-wing freak. Okay, and the national news, that's all we're made out to be, is a bunch of brain-dead fools that just fell off the apple cart. I'm from Illinois, okay, and this is the capital of corruption. And have you heard of a guy by the name of Mike Madigan?
Doug, how can you suggest that we shouldn't think of Trump supporters as Nazis when Trump openly praises Trump supporters who are carrying Nazi swastikas?
And that right there, I would challenge. I have never, ever seen anything like that. I was at his rally.
We saw Nazi swastikas in Charlottesville. We saw them in Lansing, Michigan last week. We saw them in Detroit. We're seeing them all over the country.
I think that is in response to being beat down for 3 years ever since the president got elected. I mean, he's had the FBI stacked against him from the Obama administration. They tried to derail him every step of the way.
So let me get this straight, Doug. You're saying that when people are beat down, their appropriate response is to become Nazis and wear the Nazi swastika. I have not seen black people doing that, and they've been beat down in this country for hundreds of years. What am I missing?
I'm telling you, the Nazi comparison is just out the window. I mean, I am not a frickin' Nazi, pal. Okay, I just don't get it. First off, I appreciate.
Then why do you want to hang out in a club that's filled with Nazis?
Oh, please!
I don't understand this, Doug.
36 million, the 60 million people that elected the president were all Nazis. I told your screen.
No, I'm not suggesting that. I'm talking about Trump supporters, not Trump voters.
Oh, well, there's not much of a
explicitly. Difference. And you're a Trump supporter. You are supporting people. People in your club are Nazis, and I'm not hearing you call them out. I'm not hearing you say get rid of them. I'm not hearing you say those protesters with the swastikas should be put in jail. I'm not hearing any of that, Doug.
I'm telling you right now, they are. They're reprehensible. They're lowlifes. They're scum. David Duke.
Then why don't you do something about that in your party?
Well, I'm from a blue state myself. And my point
What does that have to do with anything?
Well,
why don't you get rid of the Nazis in your own party? And why does your president keep calling them very fine people?
He did that one time that I'm aware of.
No, he did that 3 days ago. He did it with Charlottesville 2 years ago. He's repeatedly called them very fine people.
Well,
in fact, he said that Governor Whitmer should be negotiating with people with swastikas on their arms.
That is a very, it's a minority, and
he literally said that, Doug. He didn't just say it. He also tweeted it. How can you support a guy who supports Nazis? I don't get it.
I am not a Nazi supporter. Give me a frickin' break. I'm not a Nazi supporter.
Then what? Then how?
I mean, what am I supposed to do about it? I am not a Nazi supporter. I'm not a Nazi sympathizer. I'm not anything.
What you do about it is
I'm not anti-Israel like the Democrats are anti-Israel. I'm not. The Democrats are anti-Israel. I'm not.
What you do, Doug, is what so many other people in the Republican Party have done, like Steve Schmidt, who ran John McCain's campaign, for example, and a number of Republican elected officials. Jeff Flake, former Republican senator from Arizona, wrote an op-ed about this a couple of weeks ago. What you do is you leave the party and you say, I'm not coming back till the Nazis are gone.
And that will be in 4 more years, unfortunately, for you. Because he's going
join
to
Justin Amash and become an independent or a libertarian. I mean, there's space for principled conservatives.
No, and I am one of those. Believe me, I am one of them. And
then why are you supporting a guy who supports Nazis? What is he giving you that that you would be missing from somebody like Justin Amash?
You have to remember, back in the 2016, our choices were Trump or Clinton, the dirtiest politician that ever walked.
I'm not talking about Trump voters, Doug. There were a lot of well-intentioned Trump voters. I know some of them. I'm talking about Trump supporters like you.
Well, right, but I'm not a Nazi. Okay, I'm not a Nazi. And
well, then again, my question: what is Trump giving you that would cause you to stay in a party and support a man who openly supports Nazis?
First,
what's in it for you?
I disagree with the premise. I disagree with.
Is it that he's locking up brown people and their children?
I've heard him say more times than you say fine people.
Is it that he's cutting welfare benefits to black people? I mean, what is it that people? Why do people follow Trump? I don't get it.
I'll tell you why. Because he speaks his mind. He's not going through a filter.
Right. He supports Nazis.
Oh, my God. See, this type of talk, where you're coming from with your...
Well, he speaks his mind. What specifically does he say that you like?
He puts America first, period.
Yes, we're first in maternal deaths. We're first in COVID infections. We're first in COVID deaths. What is that? What the hell does America first mean? He's still making his Trump merchandise in China, Doug. His daughter's still making her stuff in China.
Well, I will say this. The whole conversation was about Nazis. And
his maggot hats are made in China.
All of the people that I know from this blue state that voted for the president are not Nazis. And I'm offended by that.
Right. Doug, well, I get it. And you're on the record. Thank you very much. And thanks for a civil conversation, Doug. I genuinely appreciate it. We will be back tomorrow. Another interesting day flies by. Keep your eyes open. I'm very concerned that we are looking at the last days of small d democracy in the United States if enough of us don't wake up. And if, good people like Doug, who I believe deep down inside, he thinks he's a good person and he's trying to do the right thing, don't start recognizing the cancer in their party and do something about it. Anyhow, we'll see you tomorrow. Share Progressive Media with your friends. Tag You're It. Have a great afternoon. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
Street like that!